The year was 410 AD. Roman rule in Britain had come to an end. The last Roman soldiers left the islands, leaving behind forts, roads, towns and settlements that no longer had the protection of the empire. Their departure created a time of uncertainty that would change the future of England for many centuries. Out of this difficult period came one of history's most remarkable changes. It was a story of conquest and Christianity, of kings and ordinary people, of great churches built on open land, and knights who fought in wars that brought either victory or defeat. The Roman invasion of Britain began because the Roman Empire wanted to expand its territory, increase its wealth, and strengthen its control over lands that lay beyond the English Channel. Roman leaders believed that bringing Britain under their rule would provide valuable natural resources, increase trade, prevent British tribes from supporting Rome's enemies on the European mainland, and add another province to an empire that already stretched across large parts of Europe, North Africa, and Western Asia. Britain was not an unknown land to the Romans. Roman merchants had traded with British communities for many years, and Roman leaders had gathered information about the island through traders, travellers, diplomats, and military campaigns in Gaul. At the time, Britain was not a single united kingdom. The island was divided among many Celtic tribes, each with its own ruler, customs, and territory. Some tribes maintained friendly relationships with their neighbours, while others often fought over land, influence, and valuable resources. Several tribal leaders had become wealthy through trade with the Roman world, importing luxury goods such as wine, fine pottery, glassware, jewellery, and decorated metal objects. Britain also exported tin, lead, iron, wool, leather, grain, hunting dogs, and other valuable products to merchants from the continent. These trading relationships gave many tribal leaders a basic understanding of Roman power and Roman culture, even though they remained politically independent. The first Roman leader to attempt an invasion of Britain was during his campaigns in Gaul. In the year 55 before the birth of Christ, he crossed the English Channel with Roman soldiers and landed on the British coast. The expedition faced serious difficulties from the beginning. Strong winds, rough seas, changing tides, and determined resistance from British warriors slowed the Roman advance. The British defended their coastline with great determination, using their knowledge of the land and attacking the Romans as they came ashore. Storms also damaged many Roman ships, making it difficult to transport supplies and maintain the campaign. After a short expedition, Caesar returned to Gaul without conquering Britain. In the following year, the year 54 before the birth of Christ, Julius Caesar launched a second invasion, with a much larger army and a stronger fleet. This expedition achieved greater success. Roman forces defeated several British tribes in battle and advanced farther inland than they had during the first expedition. Some tribal rulers accepted Roman authority, agreed to pay tribute, and offered hostages as guarantees of their loyalty. Even so, Caesar did not establish a permanent Roman province. His attention soon returned to conflicts in Gaul and political struggles within the Roman Republic. After his departure, Britain remained outside direct Roman rule for almost another 100 years. For many years after the expeditions of Julius Caesar, Roman leaders continued to pay attention to Britain, even though they did not attempt another full invasion. Traders continued to travel across the English Channel, carrying goods between Britain and the Roman world. Roman merchants visited British ports, and some British tribal leaders strengthened their connections with Rome through trade and diplomacy. Roman coins became more common in parts of southern Britain, and imported goods from the empire reached many settlements. Some tribal rulers accepted Roman support because it increased their wealth and helped them maintain their position against rival tribes. Others preferred to remain completely independent and opposed any increase in Roman influence. As the Roman Empire became stronger, its rulers looked once again toward Britain. By this time, Rome controlled a vast area that stretched across much of Europe, North Africa, and parts of Western Asia. Roman leaders believed that Britain should become part of this growing empire. They wanted to secure the northern coastline of Gaul, prevent hostile tribes from giving assistance to enemies of Rome, gain access to Britain's valuable natural resources, and increase the prestige of the emperor through another successful military campaign. The opportunity came during the reign of... He had become emperor in the year 44 after the birth of Christ and wanted to prove that he was a capable military ruler. A successful conquest of Britain would strengthen his position in Rome and demonstrate the power of the empire. Preparations for the invasion were extensive. Thousands of soldiers were gathered from different parts of the empire. Large numbers of transport ships were assembled to carry soldiers, horses, weapons, supplies, and equipment across the English Channel. Military engineers prepared tools for building roads, bridges, camps, and defensive structures once the army landed. In the year 43 after the birth of Christ, the Roman invasion of Britain finally began. The expedition was led by the experienced Roman general. 4 Roman legions crossed the English Channel, supported by auxiliary soldiers recruited from many provinces of the empire. These auxiliary forces included cavalry, archers, and other specialized units that helped the Roman army fight in different conditions. Altogether, the invading force probably numbered several tens of thousands of men, making it one of the largest military expeditions that Rome had organized. The Roman army landed successfully on the southeastern coast of Britain. The exact landing place remains uncertain, but historians believe that it was somewhere in what is now southeastern England. After reaching land, the Roman soldiers quickly established secure camps to protect their supplies and create a base for further operations. Roman discipline, careful planning, and organized logistics allowed the army to move steadily inland while maintaining communication between different units. The British tribes realized that they faced a much larger and better prepared invasion than those led by Julius Caesar many years earlier. Some tribal leaders attempted to unite their forces against the Romans. Among the most important leaders resisting the invasion were the brothers and of the powerful Catuvelauni tribe. They organized resistance by gathering warriors from several tribes and preparing to stop the Roman advance before it reached the interior of Britain. One of the first major battles took place near the River Medway. The fighting lasted for more than one day, showing how determined both sides were. Roman infantry advanced in disciplined formations, while auxiliary troops crossed the river to attack British forces from unexpected directions. Roman cavalry supported the infantry whenever opportunities appeared. British warriors fought with courage and defended their positions with determination, but the Romans gradually gained control of the battlefield. Through their training, coordination, and experience, after suffering heavy losses, the British forces withdrew to continue their resistance farther inland. A second important battle followed near the River Thames. Once again, the British attempted to stop the Roman advance. The crossing of the river was difficult, but Roman soldiers managed to force their way across despite determined opposition. Some auxiliary units were skilled swimmers and crossed the river while carrying their weapons. Their actions helped create openings that allowed the main Roman force to continue its advance. During these battles, Togodumnus is believed to have died, dealing a serious blow to British resistance. Caratacus escaped and continued the struggle, refusing to surrender even after the loss of many supporters. As news of the Roman victories reached Emperor Claudius, he decided to travel personally to Britain to take part in the final stage of the campaign. His arrival carried great political importance because it allowed him to claim direct credit for the conquest. He brought additional troops, military equipment, and even war elephants, which were intended to impress both Roman soldiers and the British tribes. After joining the army, Claudius advanced toward the important settlement of Camulodunum, which was one of the main centres of power in southeastern Britain. The settlement surrendered, and Claudius accepted the submission of several tribal rulers before returning to Rome, where he celebrated the conquest as one of the greatest achievements of his reign. When the Roman government and its soldiers finally left Britain, they left behind a land that was no longer united. Without Roman protection, many towns and villages had to look after themselves. Old systems of government became weaker, and local leaders struggled to keep peace and order. Different regions often acted on their own, and many people worried about raids, fighting, and an uncertain future. Britain had become divided, exposed to danger, and in great need of strong leadership. It was during this difficult time that new groups of people arrived, groups whose names would remain part of the history, language, and landscape of England for many centuries. The descendants of these newcomers would eventually build kingdoms that later became part of a nation whose influence spread across much of the world. The eastern coastline of Britain, which the Romans had called the Saxon Shore because of earlier attacks by sea, now stood open with very little protection. Beyond the cold grey waters of the North Sea lived several Germanic peoples who had long been familiar with the coast of Britain through trade, seasonal work and raids. Across the sea, beyond the distant horizon, communities were preparing to leave their homes in search of better opportunities. Many of these people faced growing populations that placed pressure on the land they already occupied. Changes in climate may have made farming more difficult in some places. Local disputes and competition for resources also encouraged families and warriors to seek new lands where they could build safer and more prosperous lives. The fertile river valleys, open farmland, forests, and easily defended hills of Britain became an attractive destination for these settlers. Among the people who crossed the sea were the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and the Frisians. Each group came from different parts of what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. They did not all arrive at the same time, and they did not act as one united people. Instead, their movement into Britain happened slowly over many generations. It was not a single invasion that changed the country in a short period. It was a long process that lasted for centuries. Year after year, more ships crossed the sea, more families settled in different regions, more villages were built, and more land was cleared for farming. As each generation passed, the people, the culture, and the appearance of much of Britain slowly changed. The newcomers usually travelled in small groups rather than as one large army. Each group followed its own chief or war leader. These leaders hoped to gain land, wealth, and respect by establishing settlements where their people could live safely. Some groups arrived peacefully and settled in places where land was available. Others fought local communities for control of valuable farmland or important river crossings. Different leaders competed not only against the native population, but also against one another as they searched for the best land and the greatest power. These settlers did not bring only weapons and farming tools. They also carried with them everything that shaped their way of life. They brought their languages, which would slowly develop into Old English. They brought their own systems of law and justice, which were based on local customs and traditions. They brought stories that had been passed from one generation to another. They brought their own systems of law and justice, which were based on local customs and traditions. They brought stories that had been passed from one generation to another, songs that celebrated brave ancestors, and beliefs that gave meaning to life. They also carried hopes for the future. Many dreamed of founding communities that would survive long after they were gone. They wanted their children and grandchildren to inherit land, wealth, and respected family names. The people who had lived under Roman rule for almost 400 years now faced one of the greatest changes in their history. These Romano-British communities had become used to Roman roads, Roman towns, Roman laws, and the Christian faith that had spread across much of the province. With new settlers arriving in greater numbers, they had to make difficult choices about how they would survive. Some decided to leave their homes and travel westward. They moved toward the mountains and valleys of Wales and into the southwestern lands that later became known as Cornwall. These regions offered greater protection because their hills and rugged landscapes were harder for newcomers to conquer. Many of these people carried with them the traditions of Roman life, including their Christian beliefs, their knowledge of reading and writing, and memories of the world that had existed before Rome abandoned Britain. These western regions became places where older traditions continued for many generations. Other Romano-British communities remained where they had always lived. Over time, they adjusted to the arrival of new rulers. They learned new customs, accepted new leaders, and gradually became part of the changing society around them. In many places, people from different backgrounds lived alongside one another. They traded goods, shared farming knowledge, and slowly influenced each other's cultures. The change was often gradual rather than sudden, with older traditions continuing in some places while new customs became stronger in others. Not everyone accepted these changes peacefully. Many leaders gathered warriors and fought to defend their homes, families, and way of life. Battles were fought across fields, forests, rivers, and hills as local communities tried to resist the growing settlements of the newcomers. Some victories were remembered with pride, while many defeats brought the loss of land and independence. Stories of these struggles were passed from one generation to another until they became part of history, tradition, and legend. It was during this difficult period that the person remembered as Arthur may have lived. Historians continue to debate whether Arthur was a real individual, a combination of several different military leaders, or a legendary figure created from many stories. If such a leader did exist, he was probably not the noble knight described in later stories, filled with castles, magic, and grand adventures. Instead, he may have been a military commander who tried to unite the Romano-British people against the growing number of Saxon settlements. Whether Arthur was one man or represents the memory of several brave leaders, the stories connected with his name reflect the hopes of people who wished to protect the world they had known as it slowly disappeared. These legends preserved the memory of courage, resistance, and the desire to defend one's people during a time of great uncertainty. As years passed, new kingdoms slowly formed across much of what would later become England. These kingdoms were very different from the organized Roman system that had existed before. Under Roman rule, officials managed towns, collected taxes, and enforced laws through a large government. The new kingdoms were built around personal loyalty rather than large government institutions. Power depended on the relationship between a ruler and the warriors who chose to follow him. A king was expected to lead his people in battle, protect their lands, settle disputes, and reward loyal followers with gifts, treasure and land. His position depended greatly on his ability to lead successfully. If he failed to protect his people or lost the respect of his warriors, his authority could quickly weaken. Leadership required strength, wisdom, fairness, and generosity. A successful king was expected to share wealth with those who fought beside him, strengthening the loyalty that held the kingdom together. The great halls built by these rulers became the center of community life. These large wooden buildings were places where leaders held meetings, celebrated victories, settled disagreements, welcomed visitors, and shared meals with their followers. Large fires burned inside the halls, providing warmth during cold weather and lighting the rooms where families, warriors, and guests gathered together. Strong wooden pillars supported the roofs, while carved decorations showed the skills of local craftsmen. These halls were not only homes for kings, but also places where important decisions were made and traditions were passed from one generation to the next. Among the most respected people in these halls were the scop, or court poets. Their role was much more important than simply entertaining an audience. They memorized long stories about heroes, famous battles, loyal families, and ancient ancestors. Through songs and spoken poems, they taught younger generations about courage, loyalty, honor, generosity, and duty. Their performances helped preserve history at a time when very little was written down. Every story they recited strengthened the shared identity of the people listening around the fire. The language spoken in these halls was Old English, the early form of the English language used today. Although it sounded very different from modern English, it already contained many words that would survive through the centuries. It was a rich language that allowed people to describe battles, nature, family life, faith, joy, sorrow, hope, and loss with great detail. Skilled poets carefully arranged their words to make them easier to remember when spoken aloud. Their poems celebrated bravery, loyalty, wisdom, and the difficult choices that people often faced during uncertain times. One of the greatest stories connected with this early culture was the tale of Beowulf. In this famous poem, Beowulf fights the monster Grendel to protect innocent people from danger. Later, he faces other deadly enemies as he grows older. The story was not simply told to entertain listeners. It taught important lessons about courage, leadership, sacrifice, responsibility, and the desire to protect others even at great personal risk. These stories help define the qualities that people believed every good ruler and warrior should possess. The religion followed by the early Anglo-Saxons was also rich and deeply connected to their understanding of the world. They believed in many gods, each connected with different parts of life, nature, and human experience. Several of these gods are still remembered because their names became part of the names of the days of the week. Tahayalvamu was the god closely connected with war, justice, and courage. He was remembered as a god who had sacrificed one of his hands for the good of others. Woden was associated with wisdom, knowledge, leadership, poetry, and the search for understanding. He was believed to travel widely while seeking hidden knowledge about the world. Thunor was the powerful god of thunder, storms, and strength. People believed he protected both gods and humans from dangerous forces. Frigg was linked with love, family life, motherhood, and fertility. She was respected as a wise and caring goddess who watched over homes and families. Unlike the perfect gods described in many Roman stories, the gods of the Anglo-Saxons were believed to face danger, hardship, and even death. Their stories taught that every living being, including the gods themselves, had a fate that could not always be avoided. According to their beliefs, a final battle would one day bring the destruction of both gods and the world itself. This understanding encouraged people to value bravery, loyalty, and honourable actions during their own lives, because they believed that courage remained important even when the future could not be changed. While these pagan kingdoms continued to grow across the land, another important change was beginning beyond their borders. In the monasteries of Ireland and Scotland, Christian monks carefully preserved not only the teachings of Christianity, but also many valuable books and ideas from the ancient world. During a time when much learning had disappeared in many places, these monasteries became important centres of education. Monks copied books by hand, studied languages, recorded history, and taught new generations of students. Their dedication allowed many ancient writings to survive. The form of Christianity practiced in these monasteries placed great importance on personal faith, careful study, disciplined living, and the desire to share religious teachings with others. Many monks willingly travelled long distances to spread their beliefs among people who had never heard the Christian message. They accepted difficult journeys, dangerous travel, and uncertain conditions because they believed it was their duty to teach others. Before long, these Celtic missionaries began travelling south into the growing Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. They carried copies of the Gospels, religious writings, and years of learning gained in their monasteries. They met kings, nobles, warriors, and ordinary families. Through preaching, teaching, conversation, and personal example, they slowly introduced a new faith to people who had long followed their traditional gods. Their work would eventually change the religious life, education, culture, literature, and history of Anglo-Saxon England in ways that continued to shape the country for many centuries. The departure of the Roman administration from Britain left many communities to deal with their own problems without the support of a central government. Roman soldiers no longer guarded the frontiers. Many officials returned to the European mainland, and the old system of government slowly disappeared. Although many towns remained occupied and many people continued to farm the land, the political structure that had held much of Britain together for hundreds of years became weaker. Local rulers had to protect their own lands, collect their own followers, and make decisions without help from Rome. Different parts of Britain developed in different ways, and no single ruler controlled the whole island. The eastern and southern coasts of Britain faced regular attacks from groups who crossed the sea from the lands that are now part of northern Germany, the Netherlands and Denmark. Some of these visitors came only to raid. They landed along the coast, took food, animals, weapons, and valuable goods, and then sailed home again. Others stayed for longer periods. Some were hired by British rulers as soldiers because they were known for their fighting skills. Local kings believed that these warriors could help defend their territories from enemies, especially attacks from the north and west. This practice of hiring foreign soldiers was not unusual during the final years of Roman rule and continued after Roman authority ended. Over time, the number of these foreign warriors increased. Many brought their families with them instead of returning home after completing military service. They built homes close to the places where they were stationed and began farming the surrounding land. Some married local women, while others encouraged relatives and friends from across the sea to join them. As more people arrived, new settlements appeared along rivers, fertile fields, and coastal areas where ships could easily land. Small villages slowly grew into larger communities that became permanent homes rather than temporary camps. The people who arrived in Britain came from several different groups. The largest were the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes. Each group had its own traditions, local leaders, and customs. They spoke closely related Germanic languages that were different from the Celtic languages spoken by many people already living in Britain. Their religious beliefs also differed from those of the Christian communities that had survived from Roman times. They followed a traditional religion that included many gods and sacred places connected with nature. Their customs, laws, and social life reflected beliefs that had developed over many generations in their homelands. The Angles came mainly from an area that is now part of northern Germany and southern Denmark. The Saxons came from regions farther to the south along the coast of northern Germany. The Jutes are believed to have come from the Jutland Peninsula, which forms part of modern Denmark. These regions were close enough to Britain for regular sea crossings. Small wooden ships could carry families, animals, farming tools, weapons and household goods across the North Sea. Although the journey could be dangerous because of storms and rough water, it was short enough to make repeated voyages possible. Several reasons encouraged these people to leave their homes. Some areas across the North Sea experienced population growth, making land harder to obtain. Farming families needed enough land to support children as they grew into adulthood. Competition for good farmland sometimes caused disagreements between communities. Young warriors also hoped to gain wealth, land, and influence by serving successful leaders. Britain offered opportunities because many areas had fertile soil, rivers suitable for fishing, forests full of game, and land that could be cleared for farming. Political instability within Britain also made settlement easier in some regions. The movement of people from across the sea did not happen during a single year. It continued over many generations. Different groups arrived at different times and they settled in different places. Some areas experienced only small numbers of newcomers, while others received large settlements. The process was gradual and the pattern of settlement changed as new arrivals established themselves and expanded into nearby districts. Many early settlements were located close to rivers because rivers supplied fresh water, fish, and convenient routes for travel. The settlers also chose land that could support crops and grazing animals. Forests provided timber for houses, fences, boats, and tools. Clay could be used to make pottery, while nearby streams powered simple mills in later periods. Every settlement depended on the surrounding countryside for food and building materials. The first homes built by many Anglo-Saxon settlers were made from wood with walls formed from woven branches covered in clay mixed with straw. Roofs were usually covered with thatch made from reeds or straw. Floors were often made from packed earth. Houses contained a central hearth where families cooked meals and stayed warm during cold weather. Smoke escaped through openings in the roof because chimneys were not commonly used. Furniture was simple and usually made by local craftsmen. Life in these villages depended on farming. Families grew crops such as wheat, barley, oats, and rye. They also kept cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens. Oxen helped pull ploughs through the fields. Women and men both worked in farming, although different tasks were often divided according to custom. Children helped care for animals, gathered firewood, carried water, and learned the skills they would need as adults. Food reflected the changing seasons. Bread made from grain formed an important part of many meals. People also ate vegetables, beans, peas, herbs, fruit, meat, fish, eggs, milk, butter, and cheese. Hunting added deer, wild birds, and other animals to the diet when available. Fishing supplied fresh food from rivers, lakes, and coastal waters. During autumn, families prepared food that could be stored for winter, including dried meat and preserved grain. The newcomers brought their own styles of clothing. Wool and linen were the most common materials. Women spun thread and wove cloth within the household. Clothing was often fastened with brooches made from bronze, iron, or precious metals, depending on a family's wealth. Shoes were made from leather and cloaks provided warmth during colder weather. Wealthier people sometimes wore finely decorated belts, jewellery, and embroidered clothing to show their status. Society was organised around families and local communities. Loyalty to family members and to a local leader was highly valued. A successful leader rewarded loyal followers with gifts, weapons, land, and protection. Warriors promised to support their leader during conflict. These relationships helped maintain order within communities where strong central governments did not yet exist. Different settlements gradually formed larger territories under the leadership of powerful rulers. These rulers competed for land, resources, and influence. Some expanded their authority by forming alliances through marriage. Others relied on military strength. Small kingdoms slowly appeared across eastern and southern Britain. Over time, several of these kingdoms became important political centres that influenced events across much larger regions. Among the earliest kingdoms associated with Anglo-Saxon settlement were Kent, Sussex, Essex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, and Wessex. Each developed under different local conditions. Their rulers established centres of government, collected tribute from surrounding communities, and created laws that reflected local customs. Boundaries between kingdoms often changed because of warfare, inheritance, and agreements between rulers. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons affected the people already living in Britain in different ways. In some places there was fighting as communities defended their land. Some British groups withdrew toward western and northern regions, where local rulers remained strong. Other communities continued living in areas controlled by Anglo-Saxon leaders. Archaeological discoveries suggest that interaction between newcomers and local people varied from one place to another. Evidence indicates that some settlements included people from different backgrounds living together. Language gradually changed across much of eastern and southern Britain. The Germanic languages spoken by the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes developed into what is now called Old English. This language absorbed some words from Latin and from the Celtic languages spoken by the earlier inhabitants. As Anglo-Saxon communities expanded, Old English became the main language across large areas. Many place names that remain in England today have their origins in this early language. The names of villages, rivers, hills, and fields often reflected the people who founded them or described features of the landscape. Endings such as Ham, Tun, Worth, Stead, and Bury appeared in many settlement names. These names provide valuable evidence for historians studying where different groups established communities. Even after many centuries, these place names continue to preserve information about the earliest stages of Anglo-Saxon settlement. The religious beliefs of the settlers shaped many aspects of daily life before the spread of Christianity among them. Sacred groves, springs, and open spaces were used for ceremonies. Religious festivals marked important times in the farming year. Priests and other respected individuals led rituals connected with the worship of different gods. Burial customs also reflected these beliefs. Some people were buried with weapons, jewellery, household goods, or personal possessions that families believed remained important after death. Archaeologists have uncovered many cemeteries from the early Anglo-Saxon period. These discoveries include swords, shields, spears, knives, pottery, beads, combs, glass vessels, and finely crafted jewellery. Such finds provide valuable information about clothing, social status, trade, craftsmanship, and religious customs. The quality of some objects shows that highly skilled metalworkers lived within these communities and produced items using advanced techniques passed from one generation to the next. After the Roman government ended its rule in Britain during the early 5th century, the people living across the island faced a very different future. Roman soldiers were no longer stationed across the land to protect towns, roads, and villages. Roman officials no longer collected taxes or managed local government in the same way they had done for many generations. Many large towns became smaller because trade slowed down and fewer people lived within their walls. Some Roman buildings were left empty, while others were taken apart so that their stones could be used for new homes and churches. Roads remained, but many were no longer repaired as they had been during Roman rule. Britain was no longer united under a single government, and different local leaders began to take control of different areas. During these years, many groups from the lands across the North Sea began arriving in Britain. These people included the Angles, the Saxons, the Jutes, and smaller groups from nearby regions. Some arrived as warriors hired by local British rulers to help defend the land from attacks. Others came with their families and settled permanently. More groups followed over time, crossing the sea in boats carrying people, animals, farming tools, household goods, and weapons. They settled mainly along the eastern and southern coasts before moving farther inland. The arrival of these settlers did not happen during a single journey or in a single year. It continued over many generations. Some settlements remained small villages, while others slowly grew into larger communities. Different groups often settled close to rivers, fertile farmland, forests, and places where fishing was possible. These locations gave them food, water, timber, and easy ways to travel. The newcomers built villages made up of wooden houses with thatched roofs. These homes were usually built from timber cut from nearby forests. Walls were made with wooden posts and woven branches covered with mud. Roofs were covered with straw or reeds. Families lived together with their children, and nearby fields were used for growing crops and raising animals. Farming became the center of daily life. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were among the crops grown in different parts of the land. Farmers also kept cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, and chickens. As these settlements became larger, each community needed leaders. The strongest warriors often became local chiefs. These men gained respect because they protected their people during times of danger. They settled disputes, organized farming, collected food for feasts, and led warriors into battle when necessary. Loyalty between a leader and his followers became one of the most important parts of society. Warriors promised to serve their leader faithfully, and in return they received protection, gifts, weapons, land, and food. Many villages joined together under the leadership of a powerful chief. This created small territories ruled by one family or one leading warrior. These territories sometimes expanded by peaceful agreement when nearby communities accepted the same leader. At other times they expanded after battles with neighboring groups. The borders between these territories often changed, because victories and defeats changed who controlled the land. Different families competed to become the strongest ruling house in their area. Success often depended on military strength, wise leadership, family connections, and the ability to reward loyal followers. A successful leader attracted more warriors, which made his position even stronger. As more people accepted his rule, his territory grew larger. These growing territories eventually became the first Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. At first they were not large countries with fixed borders. They were collections of villages, farms, forests, rivers, and fields under the control of one ruler. Their boundaries changed regularly because leaders fought wars, formed alliances, and sometimes divided land among their children after death. One of the earliest kingdoms to appear was Kent in the southeastern part of Britain. Many historians believe that the Jutes settled much of this region. Kent occupied an important position because it lay close to the European mainland. Ships regularly crossed the narrow sea between Kent and the lands that are now part of northern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. Trade developed quickly. Merchants brought luxury goods, glass, jewellery, pottery, cloth, and metal products into Kent, while local people exported raw materials and agricultural products. The rulers of Kent became wealthy through trade. Their growing wealth allowed them to support larger groups of warriors and maintain stronger control over their kingdom. Royal families built impressive halls where they held feasts, welcomed visitors, and rewarded loyal followers. These halls also served as places where important decisions were made and disputes were settled. To the south of Kent, another kingdom known as Sussex developed. The name meant the South Saxons. Settlers established villages across forests, river valleys, and coastal areas. Farming supported most families, while fishing also provided food. The kings of Sussex worked to unite scattered settlements under their authority. They faced competition from neighbouring rulers and spent many years strengthening their kingdom. West of Sussex, another kingdom called Wessex gradually emerged. Its name meant the West Saxons. The early rulers of Wessex expanded their territory through settlement and warfare. Forests were cleared for farming, and new villages appeared across the countryside. Rivers helped people travel, trade, and communicate with distant settlements. Over time, Wessex became one of the strongest kingdoms in southern Britain. Farther east, the Kingdom of Essex developed. Its name meant the East Saxons. It included settlements near the River Thames and surrounding regions. The location gave Essex opportunities for trade with nearby communities and with lands across the sea. Its rulers competed with neighbouring kingdoms for control of valuable land and trading routes. North of Essex lay East Anglia. This kingdom was settled mainly by the Angles. It included rich farmland and long stretches of coastline. Fishing, farming, and trade all supported its people. East Anglia became known for skilled craftsmen who produced fine jewellery, decorated weapons, and beautifully made objects from gold, silver, bronze, and garnets. Archaeological discoveries have shown that wealthy rulers were buried with valuable possessions, showing the importance of kingship and noble families. Farther north, the kingdom of Bernicia developed along the northeastern coast. South of Bernicia lay another kingdom called Deira. For many years, these two kingdoms existed separately, each ruled by its own royal family. Their rulers sometimes fought each other and sometimes cooperated. Eventually, they were united into the larger kingdom known as Northumbria. This kingdom stretched across a wide area and became one of the most powerful kingdoms in Britain. Northumbria contained rich farmland, important rivers, forests, and coastal settlements. It also developed strong centres of learning after Christianity spread across the kingdom. Monasteries became places where monks copied books, studied history, and taught students. Kings often supported these religious communities because they strengthened royal authority and encouraged learning. In the central part of Britain, another kingdom called Mercia slowly rose to power. Mercia occupied a large area with fertile farmland, rivers, forests, and important travel routes. Its central location allowed its rulers to influence many neighbouring kingdoms. Mercian kings built alliances through marriage, diplomacy, and military campaigns. They expanded their authority over smaller kingdoms and often became the most powerful rulers in southern and central Britain. The process through which these kingdoms formed was never peaceful for long periods. Warfare remained common throughout the early Anglo-Saxon age. Kings led armies made up of experienced warriors carrying spears, shields, swords, axes, and bows. Battles were fought over land, resources, trade routes, and political influence. Some campaigns lasted only a few days, while others continued through many seasons. Victory in battle allowed rulers to gain new land, collect tribute, and increase their reputation. Defeat could lead to the loss of territory or even the death of a king. Sometimes defeated rulers remained in power after agreeing to recognize a stronger king as their overlord. These relationships often changed whenever rulers died or new leaders emerged. Royal families played an important role in maintaining political stability. Kings hoped to pass their authority to sons or close relatives. However, succession was not always peaceful. Brothers, cousins, and other members of royal families sometimes competed for the throne. Rival claims often led to conflict, creating periods of uncertainty within kingdoms. Marriage also became an important political tool. Kings arranged marriages between members of different royal families to strengthen alliances and reduce conflict. These marriages helped create lasting relationships between neighboring kingdoms, although they did not always prevent future wars. Religion gradually influenced the development of these kingdoms. During the early years, many Anglo-Saxons followed traditional pagan beliefs. They worshipped different gods and held ceremonies connected with nature, warfare, farming, and family life. Sacred places included groves, springs, and other natural locations. Priests and religious leaders performed ceremonies and guided communities during important events. Christianity slowly spread through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms after missionaries arrived from both Ireland and continental Europe. Kings who accepted Christianity often encouraged their followers to do the same. Churches and monasteries were established throughout the kingdoms. Christian leaders taught reading, writing, and religious learning. Written records became more common because monks copied books and recorded important events. The spread of Christianity also strengthened communication between different kingdoms. Church leaders traveled widely, carrying ideas, books, and news from one region to another. Kings supported churches because educated churchmen could assist with administration, diplomacy, and record-keeping. Law became another important part of kingdom building. Early Anglo-Saxon kings issued laws to settle disputes and maintain order. These laws explained punishments for theft, violence, and other crimes. They also described payments that could settle disputes without continued fighting. Different social groups had different legal rights and responsibilities. Communities often gathered at local assemblies where disputes were heard. Local leaders and respected members of society listened to both sides before giving judgment. These meetings also discussed farming, boundaries, taxes, military service, and other matters affecting daily life. Land ownership became closely connected to political power. Kings rewarded loyal followers with grants of land. Noble families managed large estates, worked by farmers and labourers. Successful warriors hoped to receive land after years of service. This encouraged loyalty because land brought wealth, food, and influence. Agriculture remained the foundation of every kingdom. Most people worked on farms throughout their lives. Families planted crops during spring, cared for animals during summer, harvested grain during autumn, and prepared for winter by storing food. Villages depended on successful harvests because poor weather could lead to hunger. Craftsmen also contributed to the growth of the kingdoms. Blacksmiths made weapons, farming tools, nails, horseshoes, and household equipment. Carpenters built houses, halls, boats, and bridges. Potters produced cooking vessels and storage jars. Weavers made cloth from wool and linen. Leather workers produced shoes, belts, bags, and harnesses. Trade increased as kingdoms became more organized. Local markets allowed farmers and craftsmen to exchange goods. Merchants traveled by rivers, roads, and sea routes, carrying salt, cloth, pottery, metals, wine, glass, and luxury goods. Trading settlements gradually grew into larger towns where people from different regions met regularly. Coins slowly became more widely used in trade. Kings often issued coins bearing their names or symbols. These coins demonstrated royal authority while making trade easier. Markets became places where taxes could also be collected, increasing royal income. Kings depended upon trusted advisors. These advisors included experienced warriors, nobles, church leaders, and officials responsible for managing different parts of the kingdom. Together, they discussed military plans, legal questions, diplomacy, and relations with neighboring rulers. Communication across kingdoms depended upon messengers traveling by horse, boat, or on foot. Messages announcing alliances, declarations of war, invitations to assemblies, or royal commands moved slowly across the countryside. Roads left from Roman times remained useful, although many received little maintenance. The environment influenced where kingdoms expanded. Rivers served as natural routes for travel and trade. Forests supplied timber, firewood, and hunting grounds. Marshes sometimes protected settlements from attack, but also limited farming. Hills provided defensive positions for strongholds and lookout points. Many old Roman towns remained occupied, although often on a much smaller scale than before. Anglo-Saxon rulers sometimes used these places because they already contained walls, roads, and useful buildings. Other Roman towns gradually disappeared as villages became the main centers of daily life. Language also helped unite these developing kingdoms. Although different groups spoke slightly different forms of the Germanic language they had brought from across the sea, these languages remained closely related. Over time, they developed into Old English. Local dialects continued to exist, but people across different kingdoms could often understand one another. Poetry, songs, and storytelling preserved family history and the achievements of kings. Professional storytellers remembered long tales describing battles, famous leaders, ancestors, and important events. These stories strengthened the reputation of royal families and encouraged loyalty among followers. Children learned farming, craft skills, household work, and traditions from their families. Boys from noble families often trained as warriors from an early age. Girls learned skills needed for managing households, preparing food, weaving cloth, and raising children, although women from powerful families could also influence politics through marriage, property, and family connections. Slavery existed within Anglo-Saxon society. Some people became slaves after capture in war, while others entered slavery because of debt or punishment for crimes. Slaves worked on farms, in households, or as laborers. Their lives depended largely upon the decisions of their owners. Disease and poor harvests sometimes weakened kingdoms. Food shortages reduced populations and made military campaigns more difficult. Illness spread through villages where medical knowledge remained limited. Religious leaders often cared for the sick while also praying for recovery. Weather affected farming every year. Heavy rain, flooding, drought, or severe winters could damage crops and reduce food supplies. Successful rulers organized food collection and storage so that communities could survive difficult seasons. As kingdoms grew stronger, rulers began exercising authority over wider areas. Local chiefs who had once ruled independently increasingly accepted more powerful kings. Some did so willingly because stronger kingdoms offered greater protection. Others accepted only after military defeat. The idea of kingship became more organized over time. Kings expected loyalty from nobles, warriors, church leaders, and ordinary people. In return, they promised justice, protection, peace, and leadership. Royal ceremonies, feasts, gift-giving, and public assemblies strengthened these relationships. Different kingdoms rose and declined over many generations. Some rulers built large territories only for their successors to lose them. Other kingdoms slowly gained strength through careful leadership, successful farming, expanding trade, growing populations, and effective military organization. Political power continued shifting between Kent, Northumbria, Mercia, Wessex, East Anglia, Essex, Sussex, and smaller neighbouring kingdoms as new rulers appeared and older royal families disappeared. Throughout these years, the formation of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms remained an ongoing process, shaped by settlement, farming, warfare, trade, religion, family, connections, law, leadership, and cooperation among growing communities. Villages became territories, territories became kingdoms, and kingdoms developed institutions that allowed rulers to govern larger populations spread across forests, fields, rivers, coastlines, and growing settlements. These early kingdoms laid the political foundations that later rulers inherited as the history of England continued to develop. The history of England was shaped by the meeting of many different peoples and traditions over a very long period of time. Long before England existed as a single kingdom, the land was home to communities that had their own languages, beliefs, customs, and ways of living. As new groups arrived, they did not completely remove everything that had come before them. Instead, many old ideas continued to exist while new ones were added. This long process created a rich mixture of cultures that slowly developed into something new. Among the most important influences were the traditions of the Celtic peoples, the legacy of Roman rule, and the customs brought by the Anglo-Saxons. These three cultures came together over many generations, leaving lasting marks on everyday life, government, religion, language, farming, building, law, trade, art, and learning. Before the Romans arrived, much of Britain was inhabited by Celtic peoples. These communities lived in different tribal kingdoms spread across the land. Although they shared many customs, they were not united under a single ruler. Each tribe had its own leaders, lands, and traditions. The Celts spoke related languages that later developed into Welsh, Cornish, and Breton. Their beliefs were closely connected to nature. Rivers, hills, forests, and springs often held special meaning. Religious leaders known as Druids played important roles in spiritual life, education, and justice. Stories, songs, and family history were usually remembered by speaking rather than by writing. Skilled craftspeople produced beautiful objects made from gold, bronze, iron, and other materials. Farmers grew crops, raised animals, and traded goods with neighbouring communities. The Celtic way of life was closely connected to family and local communities. Villages were often protected by earthworks or wooden fences. Some larger settlements stood on hills where people could watch for danger. Families worked together in farming and cared for animals such as cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses. Seasonal festivals marked important times of the year, including planting, harvesting, and changes in the weather. Music, storytelling, and feasting brought communities together. Even though many tribes sometimes fought each other, they also traded goods, shared ideas, and formed alliances when needed. When the Romans invaded Britain during the 1st century after the birth of Christ, they brought a very different way of life. The Roman Empire already ruled lands across much of Europe, North Africa, and parts of Western Asia. Roman leaders wanted to bring Britain under their control for political, military and economic reasons. Roman armies slowly conquered much of southern and central Britain, although they never fully controlled every part of the island. Some Celtic tribes resisted fiercely, while others accepted Roman rule and even worked with Roman officials. Roman rule introduced new forms of government and administration. Roads connected towns, forts, and military camps across long distances. These roads made travel, trade, and communication much easier than before. Stone bridges crossed rivers, while carefully planned towns became centres of business and government. Public buildings, baths, temples, marketplaces, and large houses showed Roman ideas about city life. Some wealthy local people adopted Roman clothing, furniture, and styles of building. Others continued living in more traditional ways, while still taking advantage of Roman trade and protection. Roman law changed how many communities settled disagreements. Written records became more common, especially for taxes, property, trade, and military matters. Coins were widely used, making buying and selling easier across different regions. New farming methods increased food production in some areas. Villas owned by wealthy families became centres of large farming estates. These estates produced grain, vegetables, meat, wool, and other goods that supplied both local people and Roman soldiers. Religion also changed during Roman rule. At first, Roman officials allowed many local Celtic religious practices to continue. Temples dedicated to Roman gods sometimes stood beside places that remained important to Celtic worship. In many cases, Roman and Celtic beliefs blended together. A local Celtic god might be linked with a Roman god who had similar qualities. This allowed people to respect both traditions without feeling forced to choose only one. Over time, Christianity also reached Britain during the later years of Roman rule. At first it spread slowly, but Christian communities gradually appeared in towns and military centres. The Roman period did not erase Celtic culture. Many Celtic families continued speaking their own languages, following local customs and living in villages much as they had before. Roman influence was usually strongest in towns and richer farming areas. In more distant regions, especially in the west and north, Celtic traditions remained very strong. People often lived with both Roman and Celtic influences at the same time. A person might use Roman coins, travel on Roman roads, and still celebrate old Celtic festivals, or speak a Celtic language at home. After several centuries, the Roman Empire began facing serious problems. It struggled with attacks along its borders, political conflicts, and economic difficulties. Roman leaders needed soldiers elsewhere, and eventually the Roman army withdrew from Britain during the early 5th century after the birth of Christ. Roman officials gradually disappeared, and many towns became less active. Some buildings fell into disrepair because there were fewer workers and less money available to maintain them. Trade with other parts of the empire also became weaker. The end of Roman rule did not mean that Roman influence disappeared overnight. Roads, bridges, walls, towns, and villas remained part of the landscape. Many people still remembered Roman customs and continued using Roman buildings whenever possible. Christian communities survived in several areas. Roman farming methods, legal ideas, and styles of building also remained important. Even when official Roman government no longer existed, its influence continued through the people who had lived under Roman rule for generations. During this period of uncertainty, new groups began arriving from lands across the North Sea. Among these newcomers were the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. Together, they became known as the Anglo-Saxons. Some may have first arrived as hired soldiers, invited to defend Britain from attacks. Others came later with their families, looking for new land to settle. As more people crossed the sea, They established villages and gradually formed their own kingdoms across much of eastern and southern Britain. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons brought new languages, customs and beliefs. They spoke early forms of the language that would eventually become English. Their society was organized around families, local leaders, and warrior groups. Loyalty to a lord was highly valued. Kings depended on trusted followers who fought beside them and helped maintain order. Farming remained the foundation of everyday life, with villages surrounded by fields, woods, and grazing land. At first, many Anglo-Saxons followed their own traditional religion. They believed in many gods connected with war, wisdom, nature, and fate. Religious ceremonies often took place outdoors or at sacred places. Festivals celebrated important moments during the year. Stories about heroes, ancestors, and gods were passed from one generation to another through spoken tradition. Skilled poets entertained audiences by telling tales of courage, honor, loyalty, and adventure. Although conflict sometimes took place between the newcomers and the existing population, life was not simply a story of endless battles. Many Celtic people remained in the areas where they had always lived. Others moved westward into regions where Celtic languages stayed strong. In many places, people from different backgrounds lived close to one another. They traded goods, exchanged farming knowledge, married across cultural groups, and slowly adopted parts of each other's ways of life. The blending of cultures happened gradually rather than all at once. Roman buildings were sometimes repaired and reused by Anglo-Saxon communities. Old roads continued serving travellers, traders, and armies. Roman walls protected settlements long after Roman soldiers had gone. Some abandoned villas became sources of useful stone for building churches, houses, and defensive structures. Even when people no longer understood exactly who had built these places, they still benefited from the work left behind. Language showed clear signs of cultural blending. Old English became the main language across much of England, but it did not develop in complete isolation. Some Celtic words remained in everyday use, especially names for rivers, hills, and natural places. Many famous rivers still carry names that come from Celtic languages, because local people continued using these names even after new settlers arrived. Roman influence also survived through Latin words connected with religion, trade, government, and building. Later, Christian missionaries introduced even more Latin words into English. Over time, English became richer because it borrowed useful words from different cultures. Place names provide another example of this mixture. Some towns kept names that came from Celtic languages. Others kept Roman names or developed new names based on Anglo-Saxon words. In many places, old and new names combined together. These names still tell the story of different peoples who lived in the same areas across many generations. Religion became one of the strongest examples of cultural blending. Christianity had survived in parts of Britain after the Romans left. Irish and British Christian communities continued worshipping in Western regions. When Christian missionaries later arrived among the Anglo-Saxons, they met people with different religious traditions. The spread of Christianity among the Anglo-Saxons did not happen quickly. It took many generations. Missionaries often showed respect for existing customs whenever possible. Some old sacred places became locations for churches. Certain festivals were given Christian meaning instead of being completely removed. This helped many communities accept the new faith while keeping familiar traditions. The church itself became a meeting place for different cultures. Roman Christian traditions influenced church organization and worship. Celtic Christian communities contributed their own approaches to learning, missionary work, and religious life. Anglo-Saxon rulers supported churches and monasteries as they accepted Christianity. Together, these influences helped create a unique English church that included ideas from all three cultural backgrounds. Monasteries became important centres of learning. Monks copied books by hand, studied religious writings, and preserved knowledge from earlier times. They also recorded history, taught reading and writing, and trained future church leaders. Latin remained the language of scholarship, connecting England with other Christian lands. At the same time, books and poems were also written in Old English, making learning available to more people. Some writers combined Christian teachings with traditional Anglo-Saxon storytelling styles, creating works that reflected both older customs and newer beliefs. Art also showed the blending of cultures. Celtic artists were famous for detailed patterns with flowing lines and complex designs. Roman artists introduced realistic styles, stone carving, and building techniques. Anglo-Saxon craftspeople added their own skills in metalwork, jewellery, and decorative objects. The result was artwork that combined ideas from different traditions: crosses, manuscripts, brooches, helmets, and religious objects, often displayed designs that reflected Celtic, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon influences at the same time. Metalworkers produced beautiful objects decorated with fine patterns, coloured glass, precious stones, and carefully shaped pieces of gold or silver. These objects were valued not only because they were useful, but also because they showed great skill. Craftspeople learned from earlier traditions while adding new ideas of their own. This sharing of knowledge helped artistic styles spread across different kingdoms. Architecture also reflected cultural blending. Roman stone building techniques influenced later church construction. Anglo-Saxon builders often used wood because it was widely available, but they also learned to build with stone, especially for churches and monasteries. Some buildings stood on Roman foundations, while others used stones taken from abandoned Roman structures. Celtic religious traditions influenced the locations of certain churches and monasteries. Over time, buildings displayed features borrowed from many different sources. Farming methods improved as knowledge passed between communities. Roman farming techniques remained useful long after Roman government ended. Anglo-Saxon farmers introduced their own methods and adapted them to local conditions. Celtic farmers also contributed valuable experience gained through centuries of working the land. Families shared ideas about growing crops, caring for animals, storing food, and managing fields. This exchange helped farming become more productive in many areas. Trade connected different communities and encouraged cultural exchange. Markets brought together people from many backgrounds who bought and sold food, cloth, tools, pottery, jewellery, and livestock. Traders travelled between villages, towns, and distant regions. Goods from Europe reached England while English products were carried abroad. Along with goods came stories, ideas, religious beliefs, artistic styles, and new technologies. Law and government also developed through cultural blending. Anglo-Saxon kings created written law codes after Christianity spread. These laws reflected traditional Anglo-Saxon customs, but also showed Christian ideas about justice and mercy. Some Roman legal principles continued influencing administration and record-keeping. Local assemblies remained important, allowing communities to settle disputes and discuss public matters. Older traditions of local decision-making mixed with newer systems introduced through Christianity and royal authority. Kings understood that ruling different peoples required cooperation. Many rulers married into families from other kingdoms or cultural backgrounds. Alliances helped reduce conflict and encouraged peaceful relations. Church leaders often acted as advisors, bringing knowledge of Roman traditions and Christian teaching into royal government. Educated monks helped kings prepare documents, record laws, and communicate with other rulers. Education expanded through the work of monasteries and churches. Children who entered religious life learned reading, writing, music, and religious teaching. Some also studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and history. Books copied by monks preserved knowledge from Roman writers as well as Christian scholars. At the same time, storytellers continued sharing older Anglo-Saxon and Celtic traditions through spoken performances. Written learning and oral tradition existed side by side. Family life also reflected cultural blending. Marriage customs gradually changed under Christian influence, although older traditions continued for some time. Families remained central to society, caring for children, older relatives, and shared property. Women contributed greatly through farming, weaving, food preparation, trade, and managing households. Some women entered religious communities where they became respected teachers and leaders. Burial customs changed over time. Early Anglo-Saxons often buried people with weapons, jewelry, tools, and household objects because of beliefs about life after death. As Christianity spread, burial practices became simpler and focused more on church traditions. Even so, archaeologists sometimes find graves showing a mixture of older customs and newer Christian beliefs. These discoveries reveal that cultural change happened slowly rather than suddenly. Music and storytelling remained important throughout these centuries. Celtic traditions preserved many songs and stories remembered through spoken performance. Anglo-Saxon poets celebrated heroes, kings, and important events. Christian writers added stories from the Bible and the lives of saints. These different traditions influenced one another, creating new forms of literature that combined local history with Christian teaching. Clothing also reflected changing influences. Roman styles introduced certain types of dress and jewelry. Anglo-Saxon clothing developed its own distinctive appearance with tunics, cloaks, belts, and decorated brooches. Celtic decorative patterns remained popular in jewelry and personal ornaments. People often wore items that reflected several different traditions at the same time. Food habits changed as different farming practices spread. Bread, meat, vegetables, dairy products, and fish remained important parts of everyday meals. Roman influence introduced some new fruits, herbs, and cooking methods. Trade brought additional foods from distant regions. Communities continued adapting their diets according to local conditions while accepting useful ideas from others. The natural landscape also connected these cultures. Roman roads crossed lands that had once belonged to Celtic tribes and later served Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Rivers that carried Celtic names transported traders using Roman bridges to reach Anglo-Saxon settlements. Ancient hill forts sometimes remained visible long after their military importance had ended. Sacred places continued attracting people even when their religious meaning changed. The land itself preserved memories of different generations. Some regions experienced more blending than others. In Western Britain, Celtic language and culture remained especially strong. In eastern areas, Anglo-Saxon influence became dominant more quickly. Towns with strong Roman traditions often preserved Roman features longer than isolated villages. Even within the same kingdom, people could experience different combinations of cultural influence depending on where they lived. The development of English identity happened slowly through this long process of interaction. People did not suddenly stop being Celtic, Roman, or Anglo-Saxon. Instead, each generation inherited traditions from the past while accepting new ideas from neighbours and newcomers. Children grew up hearing stories from grandparents who remembered older customs while also learning new beliefs and practices from priests, rulers, and travellers. Learning from one another became an important part of everyday life. Farmers borrowed useful tools and methods. Builders copied successful designs. Craftspeople experimented with different artistic styles. Church leaders shared religious knowledge. Traders introduced foreign goods. Families adopted customs that suited their needs. These small changes accumulated over many generations until they shaped the whole society. Even during times of conflict, cultural exchange continued. Warfare sometimes brought destruction, but peace allowed trade, marriage, learning, and cooperation. Communities often discovered that useful knowledge could come from people with different backgrounds. Gradually, shared experiences became more important than older divisions. The written records that survive from this period show growing cooperation between church leaders, kings, scholars, and local communities. Monasteries welcomed students from different regions. Kings supported religious centers that encouraged education and literacy. Travelers carried manuscripts, artistic ideas, and religious teachings between kingdoms. These connections strengthened the blending of traditions across England. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal evidence of this cultural mixture. Excavations uncover Roman buildings reused by Anglo-Saxon settlers, Christian churches standing near older sacred sites, jewelry combining artistic traditions, and everyday objects showing influences from several cultures. Pottery, tools, coins, weapons, and household items help historians understand how ordinary people lived and adapted to changing times. Modern place names, ancient roads, church locations, languages, and historic buildings still preserve signs of this long cultural blending. Many customs that later became part of English society developed because Celtic, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon traditions met, influenced one another, and gradually became part of a shared way of life. None of these cultures disappeared completely. Each contributed important ideas that survived in different forms across later centuries. The blending of Celtic, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon cultures was not the work of a single ruler, one important battle, or one generation. It happened through countless everyday actions carried out by ordinary people. Farmers shared fields and knowledge, traders exchanged goods and ideas, craftspeople learned new skills, families formed new relationships, priests preached new beliefs while respecting familiar traditions. Builders repaired old structures and created new ones. Writers preserved memories from different cultures. Children learned languages, customs, and stories that came from several different backgrounds. As generations passed, people became less concerned with separating traditions according to their original source. Instead, they accepted practices that served their communities well. Roman roads remained useful regardless of who built them. Celtic place names continued because everyone recognized them. Anglo-Saxon language spread because it became the common language of daily life. Christianity united many communities while preserving elements of earlier traditions. Art, law, farming, education, trade, and government all reflected contributions from different peoples whose lives became closely connected across the centuries. Christianity spread through Anglo-Saxon England over many generations. It was not a sudden event that changed the lives of everyone at once. Instead, it was a slow process that involved kings, queens, monks, priests, merchants, farmers, craftsmen, and ordinary families. Different kingdoms accepted the Christian faith at different times, and the old religious beliefs continued alongside the new religion for many years. The spread of Christianity shaped the political, social, cultural, and educational life of Anglo-Saxon England and helped connect the kingdoms of England with the wider Christian world in Europe. When the Anglo-Saxons first settled in Britain after the end of Roman rule, they brought with them their own religious beliefs from Northern Europe. These beliefs were based on the worship of many gods and goddesses. Sacred places included forests, rivers, hills, and springs. Religious ceremonies were led by pagan priests, and people believed that the gods influenced war, farming, weather, health, and daily life. Festivals marked the changing seasons, and offerings were made to ask for protection, good harvests, and success in battle. Many of the early Anglo-Saxon kingdoms followed these traditional beliefs. Religion was closely connected with kingship because kings were expected to protect both their people and the customs of their ancestors. Changing religion was therefore not only a spiritual decision, but also a political one. A king who accepted Christianity often encouraged his nobles and followers to do the same, while kings who remained pagan usually continued to support the older religious traditions. Although much of Roman Britain had become Christian before Roman rule ended, Christianity did not completely disappear after the Roman government withdrew. In the western parts of Britain, including areas that later became Wales and parts of western Britain, Christian communities survived. Churches remained active, priests continued their work, and Christian learning was preserved in monasteries. These communities became important because they later helped bring Christianity back into the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. One of the most important early centres of Christianity was Ireland. Christianity had spread throughout Ireland during the 5th century, and Irish monks built monasteries that became famous for learning, prayer, and missionary work. Irish monks copied books by hand, studied the Bible, taught young students, and travelled across the sea to spread the Christian faith. Their monasteries became places where religion, education, and writing flourished. From Ireland, Christian missionaries travelled to Western Britain and beyond. One of the best known was Columba. He established a monastery on the island of Iona. This monastery became an important centre for missionary activity. Monks living there devoted themselves to prayer, learning, and teaching. They also travelled to nearby kingdoms to share Christianity with people who still followed pagan beliefs. While Irish missionaries were active in the north and west, another important effort to spread Christianity began from Rome. During the late 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great decided to send missionaries to the Anglo-Saxons. According to tradition, he had heard about the Anglo-Saxon people and wanted them to become Christians. He believed that missionary work among them would strengthen Christianity in Britain. The leader of this Roman mission was Augustine of Canterbury. He and a group of monks travelled from Rome and arrived in the Kingdom of Kent during the final years of the 6th century. Their arrival marked one of the most important moments in the history of Christianity in Anglo-Saxon England. Kent was chosen because it had strong links with the continent. Its king, Ethelbert of Kent, was married to Bertha of Kent, a Christian princess from the Frankish kingdoms. Queen Bertha had been allowed to continue practicing her Christian faith after her marriage, and she worshipped in an existing church with the help of a Christian bishop. Her presence created favourable conditions for Augustine's mission. King Ethelbert listened carefully to Augustine and his companions. Rather than forcing an immediate decision, he allowed the missionaries to settle, preach, and establish a church. Augustine impressed many people through his peaceful behaviour, religious devotion, and willingness to teach. Gradually, the king accepted Christianity and was baptized. His conversion encouraged many members of his court and many ordinary people in Kent to receive baptism as well. After the king became a Christian, churches began to appear throughout the kingdom. Priests were appointed to serve local communities, and Christian worship became more common. People learned new prayers, attended religious services, and celebrated Christian festivals. Pagan practices did not disappear immediately, but Christianity slowly became part of everyday life. Augustine established his headquarters at Canterbury Cathedral. Canterbury became the main centre of the Roman Church in Anglo-Saxon England. Augustine was appointed the first Archbishop of Canterbury, giving him responsibility for organising the church and appointing bishops in different regions. His successors continued this work for many generations. Missionaries understood that converting a kingdom required patience. They spent time learning local customs and languages so they could communicate effectively. They explained Christian teachings through sermons, conversations, and personal example. Instead of relying on force, they encouraged gradual acceptance of the new faith. The conversion of a king often influenced the rest of his kingdom. Many nobles followed the king's example because loyalty to the ruler was an important part of Anglo-Saxon society. When important families accepted Christianity, many of their servants and dependents also received baptism. This pattern helped Christianity spread from royal courts into towns and villages. Not every kingdom accepted Christianity at the same time. Some rulers welcomed missionaries, while others remained committed to pagan beliefs. Political changes also affected religion. If a Christian king died and was replaced by a pagan ruler, Christian churches sometimes lost royal support. Later, another Christian king might restore the churches and invite missionaries to return. Because of this, the spread of Christianity often moved forward in one generation and slowed in the next. The Kingdom of Northumbria became another important centre for Christian growth. Its rulers had connections with both the Roman and Irish traditions of Christianity. One of the leading missionaries in this kingdom was Aidan of Lindisfarne. He came from the monastery at Iona and established a monastery on the island of Lindisfarne. Aidan became known for his kindness, humility, and dedication. He travelled on foot from village to village, meeting people directly rather than remaining inside the monastery. He spoke with farmers, craftsmen, children, and local leaders. He taught Christian beliefs patiently and encouraged acts of charity and forgiveness. His willingness to live simply earned him great respect. The monastery at Lindisfarne quickly became one of the most important religious centres in England. Monks there devoted themselves to prayer, study, teaching, farming, and copying books. They trained new priests and missionaries who later travelled to other kingdoms. The monastery also became a place where young people received education in reading, writing, and religious knowledge. Christian monasteries served many purposes beyond worship. They became centres of learning where books were copied by hand because printing had not yet been invented. Monks carefully copied the Bible, prayers, histories, poems, and other valuable works. Every page required many hours of careful work. Beautiful decorations and colourful illustrations were often added to important manuscripts, showing both artistic skill and religious devotion. Monasteries also preserved knowledge from earlier centuries. Without the work of monks, many ancient writings might have disappeared forever. Libraries slowly grew as manuscripts were collected, copied, and protected. Students travelled to monasteries to receive education, and some later became teachers, bishops, or advisors to kings. Christianity also introduced new ideas about charity and caring for those in need. Churches and monasteries often helped the poor, welcomed travellers, cared for the sick, and provided food during difficult times. Religious leaders encouraged people to show kindness, honesty, mercy, and forgiveness in their daily lives. These teachings gradually influenced the customs of Anglo-Saxon society. Baptism became an important ceremony for new Christians. People gathered to witness baptisms, which marked a person's acceptance into the Christian community. Weddings, funerals, and other important moments in life increasingly took place under Christian guidance. Priests offered blessings, led prayers, and supported families during times of joy and sorrow. Christian festivals slowly replaced many older seasonal celebrations. Christmas and Easter became major religious occasions. Churches held special services, and communities gathered to pray together. Some older customs continued alongside the new festivals, creating traditions that reflected both Christian beliefs and local practices. The spread of Christianity also encouraged the development of written law. Christian bishops advised kings about justice and moral responsibility. Some rulers issued law codes that reflected Christian teachings about protecting the weak, respecting church property, punishing crimes fairly, and maintaining peace within the kingdom. As Christianity became stronger across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, relationships between different kingdoms also changed. Christian rulers could communicate with bishops and church leaders across Europe. Pilgrims travelled to holy places, scholars exchanged ideas, and religious books moved from one country to another. England became part of a wider Christian community that shared beliefs, learning, and traditions. As Christianity became stronger across the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, churches and monasteries continued to appear in many different places. Some were built in important towns where many people lived, while others were established in quiet, countryside locations where monks could devote themselves to prayer, study, and work. These religious communities became important parts of everyday life. They served not only as places of worship, but also as schools, centres of learning, and places where travellers, the poor and the sick could find help. Christianity also encouraged education in ways that had not been common in many Anglo-Saxon kingdoms before its arrival. Monasteries taught young boys to read and write, especially in Latin, which was the language used by the Church throughout much of Europe. Learning Latin allowed students to read the Bible, church writings, and many other important books. Some students later became priests, bishops, teachers, royal advisors, or scholars. Reading and writing were valuable skills because very few people outside the church could use them. Monks copied books by hand with great care. A single manuscript could take many months or even years to complete. Scribes used ink made from natural materials and wrote on carefully prepared animal skins known as parchment. Every letter had to be formed neatly, and mistakes were difficult to correct. Many manuscripts contained colourful decorations, carefully painted letters, and detailed illustrations that reflected both religious devotion and artistic talent. Among the greatest achievements of the monks was the preservation of knowledge. They copied not only Christian books, but also histories, poems, medical writings, laws, and works that had survived from ancient Rome. Because of their efforts, much valuable knowledge passed from one generation to another instead of being lost forever. As the Church became stronger, bishops were appointed to oversee different regions. Each bishop was responsible for supervising priests, caring for churches, encouraging education, and maintaining religious discipline. Bishops often advised kings on important political matters because they were among the best educated people in the kingdom. Their ability to read, write, and understand law made them valuable counselors. The relationship between kings and the church became increasingly important. Many rulers believed that supporting Christianity strengthened their authority. They donated land to monasteries, paid for the construction of churches, and protected religious communities. In return, church leaders prayed for the king, supported public order, and encouraged people to respect lawful authority. Royal families often played an important part in spreading Christianity. Queens who had been raised as Christians sometimes influenced their husbands and children. Christian princesses who married into pagan kingdoms brought priests, books, and religious customs with them. Their personal example sometimes encouraged the conversion of entire royal courts. Women also made important contributions through religious life. Some entered convents where they became nuns devoted to prayer, learning, and charitable work. Certain convents developed into respected centres of education, where girls from noble families received instruction in reading, writing, music, and religion. Several abbesses gained reputations for wisdom and leadership, and even kings sought their advice. One of the most respected women in the history of Anglo-Saxon Christianity was Hilda of Whitby. She led the monastery at Whitby Abbey. Under her leadership, the monastery became an important place of education and religious study. Many future bishops and church leaders received part of their education there. Hilda became widely respected for her wisdom, fairness, and ability to guide both men and women in religious life. As Christianity spread, churches became important gathering places for local communities. People attended services each week, listened to sermons, celebrated baptisms, witnessed marriages, and gathered for funerals. Religious festivals brought communities together throughout the year. These gatherings strengthened social bonds and gave people opportunities to share news, settle disagreements, and support one another. Many churches were first built from wood because timber was widely available and easier to work with than stone. As Christianity became firmly established, larger and stronger churches made from stone began to replace some of the earlier wooden buildings. Stone churches lasted much longer and reflected the growing strength of Christian communities. Missionaries continued traveling into areas where pagan beliefs remained strong. They visited villages, spoke with local leaders, and explained Christian teachings in ways that ordinary people could understand. Some missionaries faced suspicion or opposition because many people were deeply attached to the beliefs of their ancestors. Others found that local rulers welcomed them because Christianity offered stronger connections with neighboring Christian kingdoms. The process of conversion was rarely simple. Even after accepting baptism, many people continued observing older customs that had been practiced for generations. Certain seasonal celebrations, local traditions, and beliefs about nature remained popular. Church leaders understood that these customs could not disappear overnight. Instead of trying to remove every old practice immediately, they often encouraged people to give older customs new Christian meanings whenever possible. This gradual approach made Christianity easier for many communities to accept. Instead of feeling that every part of their traditional way of life had to disappear, people slowly adapted familiar customs to fit their new faith. Over many generations, Christian beliefs became deeply rooted in everyday life, while some older traditions survived in changed forms. The Church also influenced the way laws were written and enforced. Christian teachings emphasized honesty, mercy, justice, respect for marriage, protection of children, and care for widows and orphans. Kings increasingly included these ideas in their legal codes. Punishments for certain crimes remained severe by modern standards, but rulers also encouraged peaceful settlements whenever possible. Church leaders sometimes acted as mediators during disputes between powerful families. Rather than allowing every disagreement to lead to violence, bishops and priests encouraged negotiation, forgiveness, and agreements that restored peace. Although conflicts continued to occur, the Church often helped reduce violence within communities. Education continued to improve as more monasteries opened schools. Young boys learned reading, writing, grammar, music, and religious instruction. Some also studied mathematics, astronomy, and the calculation of the church calendar. Accurate calendars were important because they determined the dates of important religious festivals throughout the year. One important question concerned the proper date for celebrating Easter. Different Christian traditions use different methods for calculating this festival. In some kingdoms, churches followed the customs brought from Ireland, while others followed the customs practiced in Rome. This difference sometimes caused confusion because neighbouring communities celebrated Easter on different dates. To resolve this disagreement, King Oswiu called an important meeting known as the Synod of Whitby during the 7th century. Church leaders discussed which tradition should be followed throughout the kingdom. After hearing both sides, the king decided that the Roman method would become the official practice. This decision had lasting effects on Christianity in England. Churches across the kingdoms gradually adopted Roman customs, making religious practices more consistent. Communication with Rome and with other churches across Europe became easier, and English church leaders developed stronger relationships with religious communities on the continent. Christian learning continued to grow after the Synod of Whitby. One of the greatest scholars of the age was Bede. He lived at the monastery of Monkwearmouth Jarrow Abbey. Bede devoted much of his life to studying, teaching and writing. He wrote about history, theology, language, science, and the calculation of time. Bede's most famous work recorded the history of Christianity in England from the arrival of the Roman missionaries to his own lifetime. Because he carefully gathered information from letters, earlier writings, eyewitness accounts, and church records, modern historians still depend upon his work to understand the spread of Christianity during the Anglo-Saxon period. After Christianity became firmly established in England, monasteries became some of the most important places in the country. They were much more than buildings where monks and nuns spent their lives praying. They became centres of learning, education, writing, farming, craftsmanship, healing, and record-keeping. At a time when very few people could read or write, monasteries protected knowledge that might otherwise have disappeared. They trained new generations of church leaders, copied valuable books by hand, taught young people, welcomed travellers, cared for the poor, and preserved the history of the kingdoms that were slowly growing across England. The early monasteries that appeared in England followed ideas that had already developed in other Christian lands. Christian monks had first lived in the deserts of places such as Egypt, where they devoted themselves to prayer, fasting, and simple living. Over many years, these ideas spread through Europe, and by the time Christianity reached the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, monasteries had already become an important part of Christian life. Missionaries who came to England encouraged kings and nobles to establish monasteries because they believed these communities would strengthen the Christian faith and help spread education. Many of the first monasteries were built with the support of kings, queens, nobles, and wealthy landowners. Giving land to a monastery was seen as an act of faith. It was also a way for rulers to strengthen their kingdoms. A monastery could bring educated church leaders into an area, improve farming, and help organize local communities. It also became a place where prayers were offered every day for the people who had supported its foundation. The location of a monastery was often carefully chosen. Some were built in peaceful countryside, where monks could live quietly without many distractions. Others stood close to important roads, rivers, or towns, so they could welcome visitors and serve local communities. A few were established on islands or in remote valleys, because those places offered greater peace for prayer and study. Life inside a monastery followed a regular pattern every day. Monks rose before sunrise to pray. Throughout the day they gathered several times for worship. Between these services they worked in the fields, gardens, workshops, kitchens, libraries, and writing rooms. They also spent many hours reading the Bible and other Christian books. Silence was often encouraged so that everyone could concentrate on prayer study, and work. Meals were usually simple, and many monasteries expected their members to live modestly without seeking wealth or luxury. Every monastery had rules that guided daily life. These rules explained when to pray, when to work, when to study, and how members should treat one another. Obedience, humility, honesty, and kindness were considered important virtues. Monks promised to remain faithful to the religious life, and many stayed in the same monastery for the rest of their lives. Although life could be demanding, many believed they were serving both God and society through their work. Monasteries became places where learning was respected. At a time when education was rare, monks and nuns learned to read and write. They studied the Bible, church teachings, history, grammar, poetry, mathematics, music, and sometimes medicine. They also learned Latin because it was the main language used by the Western Church. Many religious books, official documents, and letters were written in Latin, so anyone who wished to become an educated church leader had to understand it. Learning Latin was not easy. Most people in England spoke Old English in their daily lives. Latin had different words, grammar, and pronunciation. Young students often spent many years learning how to read and understand it correctly. Teachers explained difficult passages, helped students memorize important texts, and trained them to write carefully with very few mistakes. This education required patience, discipline, and constant practice. Some monasteries became famous schools. Young boys from noble families were often sent there to receive an education. A few later became priests, bishops, abbots, royal advisors, or government officials. Others returned home with valuable knowledge that helped them manage estates or assist kings in governing their kingdoms. Education in monasteries therefore influenced not only the church, but also the political life of England. Not every student became a monk. Some attended monastery schools simply to receive an education before returning to ordinary life. Even so, they carried with them the reading and writing skills they had learned. This helped spread literacy, although only a small part of the population could read during this period. One of the most important parts of every large monastery was the scriptorium. This was the special room where monks copied books by hand. Since printing had not yet been invented, every book had to be written carefully by a skilled scribe. Creating a single book could take many months or even longer, depending on its size and decoration. Every page had to be copied slowly and accurately, because one mistake could change the meaning of an important passage. The work of a scribe demanded great concentration. Before beginning, the writing surface had to be prepared. Most books were written on parchment or vellum, which were made from animal skins that had been cleaned, stretched, and treated until they became smooth enough for writing. Producing these materials required careful work and added greatly to the value of every book. Ink also had to be prepared. Monks mixed natural materials to produce black, red, blue, green, and other colors. Feathers from large birds were shaped into writing pens. These pens needed frequent trimming to keep the writing clear and neat. Every letter had to be formed carefully because a poorly written page was difficult to read and could not easily be corrected. Many books contained beautiful decorations. Skilled artists painted large, colorful letters at the beginning of chapters. They added patterns, plants, animals, birds, and scenes from the Bible. Gold and bright colors sometimes decorated the most important pages. These decorated books were not only valuable because of their contents, but also because of the many months or even years of artistic work they represented. The creation of an illuminated manuscript required teamwork. Scribes copied the words, artists painted the decorations, and skilled craftsmen bound the finished pages together using leather covers and strong stitching. Some books were protected with wooden covers, metal fittings, or precious stones when they were intended for churches or important religious ceremonies. Books were among the most valuable possessions that a monastery owned. A large collection represented many years of patient labour. Since producing each book required so much time and effort, libraries were carefully protected. Books were stored safely and treated with great care. Borrowing a book often required permission, and returning it in good condition was considered very important. The books copied in monasteries covered many subjects. The Bible remained the most important text, but monks also copied sermons, prayers, letters, church laws, histories, poems, scientific observations, medical writings, and works written by earlier Christian scholars. Some monasteries even copied books that had originally been written in ancient Greece or Rome. Without these copies, many ancient writings would have disappeared forever. Writing helped preserve the history of England. Monks recorded important events that took place in their own monasteries and kingdoms. They wrote about kings, battles, famines, floods, diseases, royal marriages, church meetings, and unusual natural events. These written records became valuable sources of information for later generations. Modern historians still depend on many of these manuscripts to understand the early history of England. One famous example is the collection of records known as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Different monasteries kept copies and added new information over many years. The Chronicle described political events, royal successions, Viking attacks, natural disasters, and other important happenings. Although different copies sometimes disagreed with one another, together they provide an important picture of life during the Anglo-Saxon period. Monks also wrote biographies of respected church leaders and saints. These books describe their lives, religious devotion, travels, miracles that people believed they performed, and the influence they had on Christian communities. Such writings encouraged believers to follow good examples and strengthened the reputation of important monasteries connected with these holy men and women. Poetry also found a place inside monasteries. Christian poets wrote verses praising God, explaining Bible stories, or describing religious ideas. Some older poems that had originally been passed down by word of mouth were eventually written down by monks. Because of this work, famous Old English poems survived long enough to reach the modern world. Some monks became respected scholars whose work was known across Europe. They exchanged letters with church leaders in other countries, discussed difficult religious questions, and shared knowledge about history, language, and education. These connections linked England with the wider Christian world and allowed new ideas to travel from one monastery to another. Learning inside monasteries included more than reading books. Students memorized long passages from the Bible, practiced speaking Latin, studied grammar, and learned how to explain religious teachings clearly. They developed careful thinking, logical argument, and accurate writing. These skills prepared some of them for leadership positions within both the church and the royal government. Mathematics also had practical importance. Monks used numbers to calculate dates for religious festivals, especially Easter. Determining the correct date required careful observation and mathematical knowledge. Church leaders considered accurate calculations very important because Christians across different kingdoms wished to celebrate major religious festivals together. Astronomy interested many monks because it helped them understand the calendar. They observed the movement of the sun, moon, and stars to improve calculations of important dates. Their studies were based mainly on religious needs rather than scientific research in the modern sense, but they still increased knowledge about the natural world. Medicine formed another part of learning in some monasteries. Monks collected information about herbs, treatments, and healing methods. Monastery gardens often grew plants used to prepare medicines for common illnesses. Sick travellers and poor local people sometimes received treatment from monks who had learned these traditional medical skills. The monastery library became the heart of learning. Shelves filled with handwritten books represented generations of careful work. Students gathered there to read, copy texts, and discuss difficult ideas with experienced teachers. Every new book added to the library increased the knowledge available to future generations. Nunneries also played an important part in learning. Many women entered religious communities where they received education that was unavailable elsewhere. Some abbesses became highly respected leaders who managed large religious communities, supervised schools, and corresponded with kings and bishops. Their leadership demonstrated that women also contributed greatly to the spread of learning during the Anglo-Saxon period. Several royal women founded monasteries and supported education. Queens and noblewomen donated land, money, books, and valuable objects to religious communities. Some later entered monasteries themselves after the deaths of their husbands. Their support helped expand education and strengthened the position of monasteries throughout England. Monasteries also served as centres of music. Monks learned religious chants used during worship. Singing formed an important part of daily prayer, and students spent many hours learning the correct melodies. Music helped preserve religious traditions and became another important part of monastic education. Art developed alongside learning. Skilled craftsmen created stone crosses, carved wooden objects, embroidered cloth, decorated church buildings, and produced beautiful metalwork. These artistic traditions often combined Christian symbols with older local designs, creating styles that became distinctive in Anglo-Saxon England. Agriculture remained essential to monastery life. Monks worked the land to produce food for themselves and for visitors. They cultivated fields, cared for animals, managed orchards, and maintained fish ponds. Good farming practices increased food production and sometimes influenced neighbouring communities that learned from monastic experience. Hospitality formed another important responsibility. Travellers, pilgrims, and strangers often found food and shelter at monasteries. Since journeys could be long and dangerous, these places provided welcome rest. Visitors sometimes brought news from distant regions, allowing monks to learn about events taking place across England and Europe. The poor also benefited from monastery life. Religious communities distributed food, clothing, and other forms of assistance to people in need. During difficult years caused by poor harvests or disease, monasteries sometimes became important sources of relief for nearby villages. Kings frequently depended on educated monks. Since literacy remained uncommon, rulers often needed churchmen to write official letters, prepare legal documents, maintain records, and advise them on political matters. Many bishops and abbots became trusted advisors because of their education and experience. Writing gradually expanded beyond purely religious subjects. Legal documents, land agreements, royal orders, and tax records were increasingly written down. Written records reduced confusion and helped settle disagreements over land ownership and inheritance. This made writing an important tool in government as well as religion. Old English also became a respected written language. Although Latin remained the language of international learning, some scholars believed ordinary people should be able to understand Christian teachings in their own language. As a result, parts of the Bible, sermons, poems, and educational works were translated into Old English. These translations helped spread knowledge beyond those who understood Latin. Priests could read religious texts aloud to local communities, and educated people who knew Old English could study important ideas without first mastering Latin. This encouraged wider understanding of Christianity and strengthened the development of English literature. One of the greatest scholars of early England was the Venerable. Living in a monastery in the kingdom of Northumbria, he devoted much of his life to reading, writing, and teaching. His books covered history, Bible study, language, science, and the calculation of religious festivals. His most famous work described the history of the English people from the Roman period until his own lifetime. Because he carefully collected information from many sources, later, historians continue to value his writings. Another important ruler who supported learning was, he believed education had declined because of war and Viking attacks. He encouraged the restoration of schools, invited learned scholars to his court, and supported the translation of important books from Latin into Old English. He believed that educated leaders could govern more wisely and strengthen the kingdom. Viking raids created serious problems for monasteries. Many monasteries were attacked because they possessed valuable treasures, books, and precious objects. Buildings were burned, libraries destroyed, and monks killed or forced to flee. The loss of handwritten books was especially painful because each manuscript represented years of careful work that could never be fully replaced. Despite these disasters, monastic life continued. New monasteries were established, damaged libraries were rebuilt, and surviving books were copied. Once again, kings, bishops, and generous supporters helped restore religious communities after periods of destruction. Their efforts ensured that learning continued despite repeated difficulties. The rebuilding of monasteries often brought renewed interest in education. Teachers trained fresh generations of scribes, artists, and scholars. New books replaced some of those that had been lost, although many valuable works disappeared forever because no copies survived. The influence of monasteries reached far beyond religion. They preserved history, protected literature, improved education, encouraged artistic achievement, developed farming, cared for the poor, advised kings, and maintained written records. In a society where literacy remained limited, monasteries became the main centers where knowledge was collected, preserved, and shared. The tradition of careful writing established by the monasteries shaped the future development of England. Their manuscripts allowed later generations to study the language, beliefs, laws, customs, and history of the Anglo-Saxon people. Without the patient work of countless unnamed monks, nuns, scribes, artists, teachers, and scholars, much of England's early past would have been forgotten. Their dedication to learning ensured that knowledge passed from one generation to the next, allowing the written history of England to survive through many centuries of political change, war, and social transformation. From the end of the 8th century onward, the people of England began to face a new and frightening danger that came from across the sea. These attackers were known as the Vikings. They were skilled sailors, brave fighters, and experienced traders from the lands that are now called Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Although many Vikings were peaceful merchants or farmers, others became famous for carrying out sudden attacks on towns and villages along the coasts of England. Their raids changed English history in many ways. They caused fear, destroyed important centres of learning and religion, changed the way kingdoms defended themselves, and eventually led to Viking settlements across large parts of the country. The Vikings lived in northern Europe, where the land was often rocky and difficult to farm. Long winters and limited farmland made life challenging for many families. At the same time, the people of Scandinavia became highly skilled at building strong wooden ships. Their longships were among the finest boats of the early medieval world. They were long, narrow, and light enough to travel across both open seas and shallow rivers. They could sail quickly when the wind was favourable, and when there was no wind, the crew could row with many oars. This allowed the Vikings to travel to places that many other people could not easily reach. These ships made it possible for Viking groups to sail across the North Sea and reach the eastern and southern coasts of England. They often appeared without warning. Coastal communities usually had no time to prepare. Before the local people realized what was happening, Viking warriors had already landed, attacked, and gathered valuable goods. They then returned to their ships and disappeared back across the sea before any large army could stop them. The first well-known Viking attack on England took place in the year 793. Their target was the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, located off the northeastern coast of England. Lindisfarne was one of the most respected religious centres in the country. It was home to monks who spent their lives praying, studying, copying books by hand, and teaching others. The monastery also held valuable religious treasures made from gold, silver, and precious stones. These beautiful objects were used during church services and were seen as signs of deep religious devotion. When the Vikings landed at Lindisfarne, they attacked suddenly and with great violence. Many monks were killed while others were injured or taken away as prisoners. Precious objects were stolen, buildings were damaged, and sacred places were left in ruins. The attack shocked people throughout England and across Europe. Many believed that such an assault on a holy place was almost beyond belief. Religious writers described the event with great sadness and fear. They saw it as a terrible disaster that showed how dangerous the new enemy had become. The attack on Lindisfarne did not remain an isolated event. It marked the beginning of many years of Viking raids along the English coast. Other monasteries soon suffered similar attacks. Places such as Jarrow, Monk Wearmouth, Iona, and many smaller religious communities were also targeted. Monasteries often became easy victims because they were usually built near rivers or coastlines where ships could land. They also possessed valuable treasures but had little military protection. Most monks had no weapons and no training in warfare. The Vikings quickly learned that monasteries contained many riches. Beautiful crosses made of gold and silver, decorated books, fine cups, church bells, jewellery, and other valuable objects could easily be taken. Some treasures were melted down to create silver bars or coins. Other items were traded or kept as symbols of wealth and success. The attackers also captured men, women, and children who could later be sold as slaves in markets across Europe. During the early years of the raids, the Vikings usually came in small groups. They arrived during the warmer months, carried out fast attacks, and returned home before winter. These early raids focused mainly on stealing wealth rather than conquering land. However, each successful attack encouraged more Viking groups to make the dangerous journey across the sea. News of rich monasteries and poorly defended villages spread throughout Scandinavia. England at this time was divided into several kingdoms. These included Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Wessex, Kent, Essex, and Sussex. Although these kingdoms shared many cultural traditions, they often competed with one another. Their rulers sometimes fought over land, wealth, or political power. This lack of unity made it difficult to organize a strong defense against the Viking threat. While one kingdom struggled with attacks, neighboring kingdoms were not always willing or able to provide help. The Vikings carefully chose places that were easy to reach by water. England's long coastline and many rivers gave them countless opportunities to land. Rivers allowed Viking ships to travel deep into the countryside. Instead of remaining only along the coast, they could suddenly appear far inland, attacking villages, churches, markets, and royal estates that believed they were safe from danger. Life became filled with uncertainty for people living near the coast. Fishermen worried that strange ships might appear while they were working at sea. Farmers watched the horizon with fear whenever unfamiliar sails appeared. Villages began keeping a closer watch over nearby beaches and river mouths. People often built simple lookout points to warn others when enemy ships were approaching. The attacks caused serious economic problems. Farms were burned, food stores were stolen, and livestock such as cattle, sheep, pigs, and horses were taken away. Crops that had taken many months to grow could be destroyed in only a few hours. Families who lost their animals and harvests often faced hunger during the following winter. Some people abandoned their homes and moved farther inland, where they hoped to find greater safety. Trade also suffered because merchants feared travelling through dangerous coastal waters. Ships carrying goods sometimes became targets for Viking attacks. Important trading centres lost business as merchants searched for safer routes. The loss of trade reduced income for many communities and weakened local economies. The destruction of monasteries created another lasting problem. These religious houses were not only places of worship, but also centres of learning. Monks copied books by hand because the printing press had not yet been invented. They carefully preserved religious writings, historical records, poems, laws, and scientific knowledge from earlier times. When monasteries were burned, many priceless books disappeared forever. Some works that had survived for centuries were lost in a single raid and could never be replaced. Many monks escaped with only a few books or religious objects. Others hid valuable manuscripts before the attackers arrived. Sometimes entire religious communities fled from one monastery to another, carrying sacred relics with them in the hope of protecting these treasured possessions. Even so, many libraries were destroyed, and countless written records vanished from history. The fear of Viking attacks also affected daily life. Coastal settlements became quieter because many people preferred living farther away from the sea. Communities began storing food in safer places and preparing emergency plans. Local leaders encouraged stronger defences, while ordinary families remained ready to flee if warning signals were given. As time passed, Viking attacks became larger and better organised. Instead of arriving in only a few ships, some groups came with dozens or even hundreds of warriors. They stayed longer and attacked several places during the same journey. Some groups spent the winter in England rather than returning home. This change marked the beginning of a new stage in Viking activity. In the year 865, a very large Viking force arrived in England. Later writers called this army the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raiders, these warriors did not simply want treasure before sailing home. They intended to conquer land, defeat English kingdoms, and settle permanently. Their arrival transformed the conflict from a series of coastal raids into a long struggle for control of England. The Great Heathen Army captured towns, defeated kings, and forced many rulers to pay large sums of money. Several English kingdoms fell under Viking control. Northumbria was conquered after fierce fighting. East Anglia was also defeated, and its king lost his life. Mercia suffered repeated attacks and eventually lost much of its power. Only the Kingdom of Wessex managed to continue resisting successfully under determined leadership. The growing Viking presence led many English rulers to improve their defences. Fortified towns were strengthened with walls, earthworks and wooden fences. Bridges and river crossings were guarded more carefully. Kings organised local armies that could respond more quickly when enemy ships were spotted. Warning systems became more organised so that messages could travel rapidly across the countryside. The most famous English ruler to fight the Vikings was King Alfred of Wessex, later remembered as Alfred the Great. During his reign, he recognised that older methods of defence were no longer enough. he ordered the construction of fortified towns known as burhs. These defended settlements provided safe places where people could shelter during attacks. Soldiers could also gather there before moving out to confront the enemy. Alfred also improved England's naval defences. He ordered the building of ships designed specifically to challenge Viking longships. Although these early English warships did not completely stop Viking attacks, they marked an important step toward creating a stronger navy. The ability to fight at sea gradually became an essential part of defending the kingdom. The Vikings themselves were not simply warriors. After settling in England, many became farmers, craftsmen, traders, and local leaders. They established permanent communities, built homes, cultivated fields, and raised families. Over time, peaceful contact increased between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons. Trade expanded, marriages took place between the two groups, and many customs began to mix. Large areas of eastern and northern England eventually became known as the Danelaw. In these regions, Danish laws and customs played an important role in daily life. Viking settlers introduced new farming methods, trading practices, and legal traditions. Although conflicts continued, many communities gradually learned to live together. The Viking influence remained visible in the English language. Hundreds of words that people use today entered English through contact with Viking settlers. Everyday words such as sky, egg, knife, window, husband, law, and skill came from the Old Norse language spoken by many Vikings. Place names ending in by, meaning village, and thorp, meaning small settlement, also show where Viking communities once lived. Archaeological discoveries have revealed many details about this period. Excavations have uncovered Viking weapons, tools, jewellery, coins, ships, and household objects. Buried treasure known as hoards has been found across England, showing that people often hid valuable possessions during times of danger. Some of these hidden treasures were never recovered because their owners may have died before returning. The raids also encouraged stronger political unity. English rulers increasingly understood that divided kingdoms could not resist powerful foreign armies. Cooperation between kingdoms slowly increased, laying the foundation for the later unification of England under a single crown. The struggle against the Vikings became one of the major forces that shaped the development of the English kingdom. Religious life gradually recovered after the worst years of destruction. Damaged monasteries were rebuilt, churches were repaired, and new centres of learning appeared. Monks resumed copying books, educating students, and preserving historical records. Although much knowledge had been lost, determined scholars worked to restore what they could. The memory of the Viking raids remained strong for many generations. Stories of sudden attacks, burning villages, and brave defenders became part of English history and tradition. Chronicles recorded the names of battles, kings, and important events, allowing later generations to understand the challenges faced by their ancestors. The Viking raids on England's coasts began as quick attacks carried out by small groups seeking wealth. Over time, they developed into large military campaigns that reshaped politics, society, trade, religion, language, and culture. The arrival of the Vikings brought destruction and hardship, but it also led to lasting changes that became deeply woven into the history and development of medieval England. The arrival of the Vikings in England did not end with raids on towns, villages, and monasteries. As time passed, many Viking groups began to stay, instead of leaving after taking what they wanted. They stopped thinking of England as a place to visit, only for wealth, and started seeing it as a land where they could build homes, raise families, farm the land, trade with others, and create new communities. This change from raiding to settling became one of the most important developments in the history of medieval England. Viking settlements changed the people, the culture, the economy, the language, and the political map of large parts of the country for many generations. The Vikings who settled in England mainly came from the lands that are now known as Denmark and Norway. Although they shared many customs, they did not always travel together or follow the same leaders. Different groups arrived at different times. Some came as warriors looking for riches, while others arrived with wives, children, relatives, servants, and livestock. Many of them wanted more than quick victories. They wanted land that could support them for the rest of their lives. England offered many reasons for settlement. Much of the country had rich farmland, rivers full of fish, forests with useful timber, and villages that could support growing populations. The land was often easier to farm than the rocky landscapes found in many parts of Scandinavia. England also had active trade routes, growing towns, and valuable natural resources. These attractions encouraged many Viking leaders to remain instead of returning across the sea. The first permanent Viking settlements appeared after years of repeated attacks. Earlier raids had shown the Vikings where the richest lands could be found and where local defences were weakest. As Viking fleets became larger and better organised, they arrived with enough people to seize and hold territory. Instead of sailing away after each attack, they built camps that became permanent settlements. Wooden houses replaced temporary shelters, fields were cleared for farming, and families began new lives. One of the most important turning points came during the late 9th century when a large Viking army arrived in England. Unlike earlier raiding groups, this force was not interested only in taking treasure. It moved through different kingdoms, defeated local rulers, demanded tribute, and occupied large areas of land. Some members of the army continued fighting, while others divided the land among themselves and became farmers. This marked the beginning of widespread Viking settlement across eastern and northern England. Many Anglo-Saxon kingdoms struggled to resist these newcomers. Some rulers fought hard but were defeated. Others agreed to pay large amounts of money in return for peace. In several places, local leaders accepted Viking rule because they hoped it would bring stability after years of violence. The political map of England changed as Viking-controlled regions grew larger. The largest Viking-controlled area became known as the Danelaw. This was the part of England where Danish customs, traditions and laws were officially recognised. The Danelaw covered much of eastern and northern England. Instead of following the laws of the Anglo-Saxon kings, many communities followed rules based on Scandinavian traditions. Local courts settled disputes, collected fines, and managed everyday life according to customs brought from across the North Sea. Life in Viking settlements was based mainly on farming. Families cleared forests, ploughed fields, planted crops, and raised animals. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were common crops. People also kept cattle, sheep, pigs, goats, horses, and chickens. Farming provided food not only for individual families, but also for growing towns. The Vikings were experienced farmers who knew how to make good use of the land. They repaired old fields and opened new ones wherever possible. Fishing also played a major part in Viking life. Rivers, lakes, and coastal waters provided large supplies of fish. Fish could be dried, salted, or smoked, so they would last through the winter. Hunting added meat, skins, and furs to the local economy. Forests supplied deer, wild birds, rabbits, and other animals. People gathered berries, nuts, herbs, and honey from the countryside. Trade quickly became one of the strongest parts of Viking settlements. The Vikings were not only warriors, but also skilled merchants. They connected England with trading networks that stretched across Scandinavia, Ireland, mainland Europe, and even distant parts of Asia through long chains of exchange. Goods moved from one region to another by ship and along rivers. Markets became busy places where people bought and sold food, cloth, tools, weapons, pottery, jewelry, leather goods, timber, and livestock. Silver became especially important in Viking trade. Coins, silver bars, and pieces of cut silver were widely used for payment. Many buried collections of silver have been discovered by archaeologists. These hidden treasures were often buried during times of danger, with the owners hoping to recover them later. Some were never returned to, leaving valuable evidence of Viking wealth and trade. Towns grew larger under Viking influence. Some old Roman towns became active again after years of decline. Other settlements expanded because of their good position near rivers or coastlines. Streets became busier with craftsmen, traders, farmers, sailors, and travelers. Markets attracted people from surrounding villages, encouraging trade and communication between different regions. The Vikings introduced many skilled crafts into their settlements. Blacksmiths made tools, nails, horseshoes, knives, swords, and farming equipment. Carpenters built houses, ships, furniture, and wagons. Leather workers produced shoes, belts, bags, and armor. Weavers made cloth from wool and flax. Potters created cooking pots, bowls, and storage jars. Jewelry makers crafted beautiful objects from silver, bronze, gold, amber, and glass. These crafts supported local economies and helped settlements become more prosperous. Viking houses were usually built from timber, with walls made of wooden planks or woven branches covered with clay. Roofs were often covered with straw, reeds, or turf. Inside, a central fire provided warmth, light, and a place for cooking. Families shared the same large room with their children, servants, and sometimes even animals during cold weather. Furniture was simple but practical, including benches, chests, beds, and wooden tables. Women played important roles within Viking settlements. They managed households, prepared food, spun thread, wove cloth, cared for children, milked animals, and sometimes helped with farming. Some women also managed farms when their husbands travelled for trade or warfare. Archaeological discoveries suggest that many women owned valuable jewelry and household goods, showing that they held respected positions within their communities. Children learned practical skills from an early age. Boys often helped with farming, fishing, hunting, and woodworking. Girls learned spinning, weaving, cooking, and household management, although many children worked together regardless of these divisions. As they grew older, young people took greater responsibilities within their families and communities. Religion also changed within Viking settlements. When the first settlers arrived, most followed the Old Norse religion. They believed in gods such as Odin, Thor, and Freya. Religious ceremonies often included offerings to these gods for protection, good harvests, and success in war or travel. Sacred places could include forests, hills, springs, or specially chosen gathering sites. As Vikings lived alongside Christian Anglo-Saxons, many gradually accepted Christianity. Some converted through peaceful contact with local people, while others did so after agreements with Christian rulers. Viking leaders often accepted baptism to strengthen political alliances or gain acceptance among their new neighbours. Churches were built in many settlements, and Christian burial customs slowly replaced older traditions. Even after conversion, some older beliefs and customs remained part of everyday life for many years. Marriage helped strengthen relationships between Viking settlers and Anglo-Saxon families. Over time, many people married across cultural backgrounds. Their children grew up speaking both Old Norse and Old English. These families blended customs, traditions, and ways of life. As generations passed, it became harder to separate Viking settlers from the local population because their communities became closely connected. Language changed greatly because of Viking settlement. Thousands of Old Norse words entered everyday speech. Many common English words used today came from the language of the Vikings. Simple words connected with family life, farming, weather, law, trade, and daily activities became part of the English language. Even basic words such as they, them, and their have Viking origins. This lasting influence shows how closely the two peoples lived together. Place names across England also reveal the extent of Viking settlement. Many towns and villages ending with words such as by, meaning village, or thorp, meaning small settlement, were founded or renamed by Viking settlers. Other names contain Scandinavian words for rivers, hills, valleys, farms, and fields. These names remain visible on modern maps and continue to show where Viking communities once flourished. The legal system within Viking settlements reflected Scandinavian traditions. Local assemblies gathered regularly to settle disputes, decide punishments, and discuss community matters. Free men often took part in these meetings. Decisions were based on accepted customs, witness testimony, and agreements between families. Compensation through payments was frequently preferred over long-lasting blood feuds, although revenge sometimes remained part of society. Viking settlements also depended on strong local leadership. Wealthy landowners and respected warriors often became leaders within their communities. They organized defenses, settled disagreements, and represented local interests. Loyalty between leaders and followers remained important, especially during times of conflict. Expansion continued as settlements became stronger. New farms spread into forests and uncultivated land. Villages divided as younger generations established homes nearby. Trade encouraged the growth of new market centres, while improved farming supported larger populations. Rivers served as natural highways that connected inland settlements with coastal ports. Ships remained essential even after settlement. Viking shipbuilders continued producing strong wooden vessels for fishing, trade, travel, and warfare. Rivers allowed goods to move quickly between different parts of England. Coastal shipping often proved faster than travelling by rough roads. Shipbuilding remained an important industry in many Viking communities. Relations between Vikings and Anglo-Saxons were not always peaceful. Disagreements over land, power, and taxes sometimes led to fighting. Different Viking leaders also fought among themselves. Yet peaceful cooperation became increasingly common as communities depended on trade, farming, and shared local interests. Daily life encouraged people to work together despite their different backgrounds. The English kings did not accept Viking control forever. Several rulers launched campaigns to recover occupied lands. They built stronger armies, improved defences, and constructed fortified towns that could resist attacks. Some kings negotiated treaties while others fought long wars to bring Viking territories under English rule. Even when political control changed, many Viking settlers remained on their farms and continued living in England. The efforts of English rulers eventually united much of the country under one crown. Even so, Viking influence remained deeply rooted. Scandinavian families continued farming, trading, serving in local government, and taking part in the life of the kingdom. Their descendants became fully integrated into English society, while still preserving parts of their heritage. Archaeological discoveries have provided valuable evidence about Viking settlements. Excavations have uncovered houses, workshops, tools, jewellery, coins, weapons, ships, and everyday household objects. Animal bones reveal what people ate. Seeds and farming tools show how crops were grown. Buried treasure demonstrates the importance of silver and trade. Written records from both Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian sources help historians understand how these settlements developed over time. The expansion of Viking settlements also influenced neighbouring regions beyond England. Strong connections existed with Scotland, Ireland, the Isle of Man, Wales, Normandy, and Scandinavia. Merchants, travellers, pilgrims, and warriors moved regularly between these places. New ideas, goods, technologies, and cultural traditions spread through these contacts, creating wider networks across Northern Europe. After years of fierce Viking attacks, many parts of England came under the control of Scandinavian warriors and settlers. This created one of the most important periods in English history, when the country was divided between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the lands ruled by the Danes. The area that came under Danish rule became known as the Danelaw. It was not simply a region occupied by foreign soldiers. It developed into a place where different peoples, traditions, languages, and laws mixed together. The existence of the Danelaw changed the political map of England, influenced its culture, shaped its language, and left a lasting mark that can still be seen today. The creation of the Danelaw was the result of many years of Viking raids that gradually became larger and more organized. At first, Viking warriors crossed the North Sea mainly to raid monasteries, villages, and towns, before returning home with their loot. As time passed, these attacks changed. Instead of coming only during the summer months, Viking armies began staying through the winter. They built camps, gathered supplies, and prepared for new campaigns. Eventually, they stopped thinking only about stealing wealth and began planning to settle permanently. One of the most important Viking forces was known as the Great Heathen Army. It arrived in England during the middle of the 9th century. Unlike earlier raiding groups, this army was large, disciplined, and determined to conquer land rather than simply collect treasure. It moved from one kingdom to another, defeating rulers, capturing towns, and forcing many Anglo-Saxon kings to pay tribute. Some kingdoms fell completely under Viking control, while others struggled to survive. At that time, England was not a single united country. It was divided into several kingdoms, including Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, and Wessex. These kingdoms often fought each other even before the Vikings arrived. Their lack of unity made it easier for the Viking armies to defeat them one by one. The kingdom of Northumbria was among the first to suffer. Internal fighting between rival kings weakened its defences. The Vikings captured the important city of York during the middle of the 9th century. York became one of the greatest Viking centres in England. It served as a military base, a trading city, and the capital of the Viking kingdom in northern England. Scandinavian settlers built homes there, established markets, and turned the city into a busy centre of trade that connected England with Scandinavia, Ireland, and lands across Europe. East Anglia also fell to the Vikings. The local king was defeated after refusing to submit to Danish demands. According to later traditions, he chose death rather than abandon his Christian faith. After his defeat, the Vikings took control of the kingdom and settled many Danish families there. Mercia also suffered greatly. Large areas of the kingdom came under Viking rule. The remaining Anglo-Saxon rulers were forced to make peace with the invaders, although their authority became much weaker. Gradually, the Danes controlled much of eastern and northern England. Only the kingdom of Wessex continued to resist successfully for a long period. Under the leadership of King Alfred, later remembered as Alfred the Great, Wessex fought desperately to survive. Alfred suffered defeats but refused to surrender. He reorganized his army, strengthened defences, and built fortified towns where people could take shelter during Viking attacks. His determination eventually changed the course of English history. One of the most important moments came when Alfred defeated the Viking leader Guthrum in battle during the late 9th century. After this victory, both leaders agreed to make peace instead of continuing endless warfare. Their agreement became known as the Treaty of Wedmore. Under this settlement, England was divided into different areas of control. Alfred remained ruler of Wessex, while Guthrum accepted control over much of eastern and northern England. The lands under Danish authority gradually became known as the Danelaw. The name reflected the fact that Danish customs and legal traditions were followed there instead of the laws used in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Although the exact boundaries changed over time, the Danelaw covered a very large part of England. It stretched across much of Northumbria, East Anglia, Eastern Mercia, and other surrounding regions. The Danelaw was not completely separated from the rest of England. People continued to travel between different regions. Merchants crossed borders to sell goods. Farmers traded crops and animals. Craftsmen exchanged skills and products. Families sometimes had relatives living on both sides of the frontier. The border itself changed as wars continued, making it more of a broad frontier than a fixed line. Life inside the Danelaw was shaped by both Danish and Anglo-Saxon traditions. Viking settlers did not simply remove the existing population. Instead, many local people remained on their farms and in their villages. Over time, Danish settlers married local women, raised families, and became permanent members of the community. Children often grew up learning customs from both sides of their family. The legal system within the Danelaw reflected Scandinavian ideas about justice. Local assemblies played an important role in settling disputes. Communities gathered to hear cases, discuss disagreements, and make decisions together. These meetings gave ordinary free men opportunities to participate in local government. Although kings still held authority, local communities often enjoyed considerable independence in handling everyday matters. Many legal words that entered the English language came from the Scandinavian settlers. Some ideas about justice, property rights, and local government survived long after the Viking period ended. The influence of these legal traditions remained visible for centuries. The arrival of Danish settlers also changed farming. Many Vikings were experienced farmers as well as warriors. They cleared land, built farms, raised animals, and cultivated crops. Instead of destroying the countryside, many settlers worked to improve it because they intended to live there permanently. Villages expanded, new fields were developed, and food production increased in many regions. Trade flourished throughout the Danelaw. Viking merchants maintained trading networks that stretched across northern Europe. Goods arrived from Scandinavia, Ireland, the Baltic lands, and even places much farther away. Traders exchanged wool, leather, cloth, timber, iron, weapons, jewelry, amber, silver, and slaves. Markets became busy places where people speaking different languages met to buy and sell goods. York became one of the greatest trading cities in northern Europe during this period. Skilled craftsmen produced fine metalwork, jewelry, leather goods, glass objects, and beautifully carved items made from bone and antlers. Archaeological discoveries show that the city's workshops were busy throughout the year, producing goods that were sold across many different countries. The Danelaw also influenced language in remarkable ways. Danish settlers spoke Old Norse, while the local population spoke Old English. Because the two languages were related, many people gradually learned to understand one another. Words from Old Norse entered everyday speech, especially in areas where Vikings settled in large numbers. Many common English words still come from Old Norse. Words such as sky, egg, window, husband or law, knife, skin and anger all have Scandinavian origins. Even simple everyday words like they, them and their eventually replaced older English forms in many parts of the country. Few invasions in history have changed a language so deeply. Place names also reveal the Viking presence. Hundreds of towns and villages across northern and eastern England have names ending in forms such as by, meaning village or settlement, thorpe meaning a small settlement, and thwaite, referring to a clearing in woodland. These names continue to remind people where Scandinavian settlers once established their homes. Religion also developed during this period. Many Vikings first arrived as followers of the Old Norse gods, including Odin, Thor, and Frey. However, many eventually accepted Christianity after settling in England. Some converted because of political agreements with Anglo-Saxon rulers, while others adopted the new faith after living among Christian neighbours. Guthrum himself accepted Christianity as part of the peace agreement with Alfred. During his baptism he received a Christian name, symbolising both his new religion and his commitment to peace. His example encouraged many other Danish settlers to become Christians as well. Religious conversion did not happen overnight. Old customs continued alongside Christian beliefs for many years. Archaeologists have found evidence showing that people sometimes combined Christian symbols with older Scandinavian traditions. Gradually, churches became more common throughout the Danelaw, and Christian practices spread among the population. The military importance of the Danelaw remained significant for many years. Viking leaders continued to rule their territories, while Anglo-Saxon kings worked to strengthen their own kingdoms. Neither side completely trusted the other. Periods of peace were often interrupted by new wars, changing alliances, and fresh invasions from Scandinavia. Alfred and his successors realized that lasting security required more than winning individual battles. They expanded the network of fortified towns, improved roads, strengthened bridges, and organized local defenses. These preparations allowed armies to move more quickly whenever danger appeared. After Alfred's death, his children and grandchildren continued his work. They gradually captured territories that had belonged to the Danelaw. Sometimes these lands were taken through warfare. At other times, local leaders accepted Anglo-Saxon rule peacefully. The process took many years, but the kings of Wessex slowly extended their authority across much of England. Even after the Danelaw came under English kings, Scandinavian influence did not disappear. Danish communities remained where they had settled. Their customs, language, farming methods, trade connections, and family traditions continued to shape everyday life. Instead of forcing people to abandon their identities, many rulers allowed local traditions to continue. The blending of Anglo-Saxon and Scandinavian cultures produced a society that was different from either culture alone. People borrowed ideas from one another in farming, building techniques, trade, language, law, and government. This cultural exchange became one of the defining features of medieval England. Many later kings recognized the importance of maintaining peace between people of different backgrounds. Laws increasingly treated English and Danish communities more equally. Over time, the distinction between Anglo-Saxons and Danes became less important as families mixed and communities grew together. The influence of the Danelaw also reached beyond England. Trade with Scandinavia remained strong, allowing ideas, technology, artistic styles and commercial practices to move across the North Sea. English merchants gained access to wider markets, while Scandinavian traders found profitable opportunities in English towns. Archaeological discoveries continue to reveal the richness of life within the Danelaw. Excavations have uncovered Viking houses, workshops, coins, weapons, jewellery, farming tools, ships, and everyday household objects. These discoveries show that the region was not simply a military frontier, but a thriving society where farming, craftsmanship, trade, religion, and family life all developed together. Coins from the period often carried the names of both English and Scandinavian rulers, reflecting the changing balance of power. The wide circulation of these coins demonstrates the strength of trade and the increasing integration of different communities. The story of the Danelaw shows that conquest was only one part of Viking history in England. The settlers built towns, established farms, created businesses, raised children, and became permanent residents. Their descendants contributed to the development of English society for generations. The division of England between Anglo-Saxon and Danish rulers created conflict, but it also encouraged cooperation, cultural exchange, economic growth, and political change. The legacy of the Danelaw remained visible long after Viking rule ended, shaping England's language, laws, settlements, and national development for centuries to come. The Kingdom of Wessex slowly grew from one of several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into the strongest and most powerful kingdom in England. This change did not happen quickly. It took many generations of kings, warriors, church leaders, and ordinary people who worked to strengthen their land, protect their people, and build a stable government. The rise of Wessex became one of the most important turning points in the history of England because it laid the foundation for the creation of a single English kingdom. At the centre of this remarkable story stood one of the most respected rulers in English history, King Alfred, later remembered as Alfred the Great. Wessex was located in the southern part of England. Its lands included rich farming areas, forests, rivers, and hills that supported growing communities. Villages and towns became centres of farming, trade, and craftsmanship. Families worked the land, raised animals, and produced food that helped the kingdom become wealthier. The kings of Wessex depended on loyal nobles, local leaders, and experienced warriors who defended the kingdom whenever danger appeared. Strong relationships between the king and his followers allowed Wessex to survive many difficult times. During its early history, Wessex often faced powerful rivals. Other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms such as Mercia, Northumbria, Kent, and East Anglia also wanted influence and control over different parts of England. Sometimes these kingdoms fought each other. At other times they formed alliances through marriage or agreements. Power often shifted from one kingdom to another. A kingdom that seemed strong in one generation could become weak in the next because of war, poor leadership, or attacks from outside enemies. Several early kings helped Wessex become stronger. They expanded their borders, improved their armies, and formed useful alliances with neighbouring kingdoms. They encouraged farming, supported churches, and worked to keep peace within their lands. Their efforts slowly increased the kingdom's wealth and influence. By the time later rulers came to power, Wessex had already developed a strong foundation that allowed it to face greater challenges. The greatest challenge arrived with the Vikings. These seafaring warriors came from Scandinavia and first appeared as raiders along the coasts of Britain. They attacked monasteries because these places often contained valuable treasures, but had little protection. As time passed, Viking attacks became larger and more organized. Instead of simply taking treasure and sailing away, many Viking groups remained in England. They built camps, settled on the land, and tried to conquer entire kingdoms. During the middle years of the 9th century, a very large Viking force arrived in England. Later writers called it the Great Heathen Army. Unlike earlier raiders, this army had the clear goal of conquering land and establishing permanent rule. One by one, several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms fell before its attacks. East Anglia was defeated. Northumbria came under Viking control. Mercia also suffered heavy losses and lost much of its independence. As these kingdoms weakened, Wessex became the last major Anglo-Saxon kingdom still able to resist the Viking advance. King Alfred was born around the middle of the 9th century into the royal family of Wessex. Even as a child, he showed a strong interest in learning. Stories tell that he enjoyed listening to poems, religious teachings, and tales of great heroes. Although opportunities for education were limited during that time, Alfred valued knowledge from a young age. His parents encouraged his interest in books, and he developed a respect for wisdom that stayed with him throughout his life. As a young prince, Alfred gained experience by accompanying older family members on journeys and in matters of government. He learned how kings ruled their people, settled disagreements, rewarded loyal followers, and defended their lands. These experiences prepared him for responsibilities that he could not yet imagine. Alfred became King of Wessex during a very dangerous period after the death of his brother in the year 871. The kingdom was already under heavy attack from Viking armies. Almost immediately after becoming king, Alfred found himself leading soldiers into battle. His position was extremely difficult because the enemy was experienced, well armed, and determined to conquer Wessex, just as they had conquered other kingdoms. The first years of Alfred's reign were filled with hardship. Viking armies launched repeated attacks against Wessex. Some battles ended in victory for Alfred's forces, while others ended in defeat. Each campaign demanded great courage and careful planning. The king had to inspire his soldiers even when hope seemed to be fading. He also had to ensure that villages continued producing food and that supplies reached the army. The most dangerous moment came in the year 878. The Viking leader Guthrum launched a surprise attack during the winter, while many people believed there would be peace because of a religious festival. Alfred and his followers were caught unprepared. They escaped into the marshes of Athelney in Somerset. From this isolated and difficult landscape, Alfred refused to surrender. Instead, he quietly gathered loyal supporters from different parts of Wessex. Many later stories describe Alfred's time in hiding. One famous legend tells of him allowing cakes to burn while thinking deeply about the future of his kingdom. Whether this story is true or not, it reflects how later generations viewed Alfred as a thoughtful and humble ruler who remained focused on the welfare of his people even during the darkest moments. From his refuge, Alfred carefully planned his return. Secret messages were sent throughout Wessex, calling loyal men to gather for a final effort against the Vikings. Farmers, local leaders, experienced warriors, and ordinary people answered the call. They understood that if Wessex fell, there might be no independent Anglo-Saxon kingdom left. Alfred led his army to a decisive battle against Guthrum at the Battle of Edington in the year 878. The fighting was fierce, but Alfred's army achieved a great victory. Guthrum's forces were defeated and surrounded. Instead of destroying his defeated enemy, Alfred chose a path that offered greater stability. Guthrum agreed to accept Christianity and made peace with Wessex. This agreement reduced immediate fighting and allowed Alfred to begin rebuilding his kingdom. The peace agreement also helped define the areas controlled by the Vikings and those ruled by Wessex. Much of northern and eastern England remained under Viking rule, while Wessex continued to govern the south and southwest. This division did not end all conflict, but it gave Alfred valuable time to strengthen his kingdom. Alfred understood that future Viking attacks were almost certain. Rather than waiting for another invasion, he introduced many important reforms. He reorganized the army so that only part of the fighting force served at one time while others remained at home to farm the land. This ensured that food production continued even during war. Fresh soldiers could replace tired ones, allowing the kingdom to defend itself for longer periods. He also ordered the construction of many fortified towns known as burhs. These towns were surrounded by strong walls, earthworks, and defensive barriers. Soldiers could protect the people living inside, while nearby villagers could quickly seek safety whenever enemy armies approached. The network of fortified towns made it much more difficult for Viking armies to capture territory, because they could no longer move freely across the countryside. Roads connecting these fortified towns were improved so that soldiers and supplies could travel more quickly. Messengers carried important information between different parts of the kingdom, allowing Alfred's government to respond faster whenever danger appeared. This organized defensive system became one of Alfred's greatest achievements and continued to protect England for many years after his death. Alfred also realized that control of the sea was important. Since the Vikings depended heavily on ships, he ordered the construction of stronger warships to defend the coast. These ships were designed to challenge Viking vessels before they reached land. Although Alfred's navy was still small compared with later English fleets, it marked an important beginning in the development of English naval power. The king believed that wisdom was just as important as military strength. He was deeply concerned that learning had declined after years of war. Many monasteries had been destroyed, books had been lost, and fewer people could read or write. Alfred believed that a kingdom could not remain strong if knowledge disappeared. He invited learned men from different parts of Britain and continental Europe to his court. Together, they worked to restore education and religious learning. Schools were encouraged, especially for the sons of nobles and officials who would one day help govern the kingdom. Alfred believed that leaders should be educated so they could make fair decisions and serve the people wisely. Because many educated people no longer understood Latin well enough to read important books, Alfred encouraged the translation of valuable works into Old English, the language spoken by most of his people. He believed that knowledge should not belong only to a small group of scholars. Instead, it should become available to everyone who was able to learn. Alfred himself took part in translating several important books and encouraged others to continue this work. His interest in education extended beyond religion. He believed that history, law, morality, and practical knowledge could all help create better rulers and better citizens. His efforts helped preserve many important writings that might otherwise have disappeared forever. Alfred also improved the legal system. He gathered earlier laws made by previous kings and combined them with Christian teachings to create a more organized legal code. His laws aimed to protect the weak, punish criminals fairly, and encourage justice throughout the kingdom. Judges were expected to decide cases honestly instead of accepting bribes or showing favoritism. The king worked hard to strengthen royal government. Local officials became more responsible for collecting taxes, maintaining roads and defences, and ensuring that laws were followed. Better organization allowed the kingdom to function more effectively, even during difficult times. Trade slowly recovered under Alfred's rule. Markets became safer because fortified towns offered protection against raids. Merchants could travel with greater confidence, bringing goods from different regions. Farmers continued producing crops. Craftsmen made tools and household items, and trade contributed to the kingdom's growing prosperity. religion remained an important part of Alfred's life. He supported churches and monasteries, encouraged prayer and religious learning, and believed that rulers should govern with humility and fairness. Church leaders often advised him, while monasteries once again became centres of education, writing, and record-keeping. Although Alfred achieved many successes, challenges remained throughout his reign. Viking groups continued to threaten England, and occasional fighting still occurred. Alfred never believed that victory meant danger had disappeared. He remained alert, constantly improving defences and preparing for future attacks. By the later years of his reign, Wessex had become stronger than it had ever been before. Other English people increasingly looked to Alfred as the leader most capable of defending their shared culture and traditions. His influence extended beyond the borders of Wessex, as more regions accepted his leadership or cooperated with his government. Alfred died in the year 899. His death marked the end of an extraordinary reign, but his work did not end with him. His son, Edward the Elder, and his daughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, continued many of his policies. Together, they expanded English control into lands that had been ruled by the Vikings. Their victories built directly upon the strong foundations that Alfred had created. Over time, Alfred became remembered not only as a successful military commander, but also as a wise lawgiver, an energetic reformer, a supporter of education, and a ruler who cared deeply about the well-being of his people. Few kings in early English history left such a lasting influence on government, learning, justice, military organisation, and national identity. The rise of Wessex under Alfred transformed the political history of England. A kingdom that had once struggled simply to survive became the centre of resistance against Viking conquest, and later became the heart of a united English kingdom. Alfred's careful planning, determination during times of danger, commitment to learning, respect for justice, and ability to inspire loyalty ensured that Wessex remained strong when many other kingdoms had fallen. His achievements continued shaping England for many generations, making Alfred the Great one of the most admired and influential rulers in the history of the English people. After many years of war between the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms and the Vikings, England slowly became more united under a single ruler. Earlier kings of Wessex, especially Alfred the Great, and his children and grandchildren, had fought to protect their lands from Viking attacks. They also worked to bring the different English kingdoms under one crown. By the middle of the 10th century, most of the land that is now called England was ruled by one king. This marked the beginning of a united English kingdom. The rulers who came after Alfred continued his work. They defeated Viking armies, regained lands that had been controlled by the Danes, and strengthened the authority of the king. One of the most important rulers during this period was King Athelstan. He became king in the early 10th century, and is often remembered as the first ruler to govern nearly all of England. Under his leadership, the old kingdoms of Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, and Sussex became part of one kingdom. Although each area kept some of its local customs and traditions, they were now expected to obey one king. The kings of England worked hard to create a stronger government. They appointed trusted officials to collect taxes, enforce laws, and manage towns and villages. Local leaders still played important roles, but they now answered to the king instead of acting completely on their own. Royal officials travelled across the country to settle disputes, collect payments, and make sure that the king's orders were followed. This system helped create a more organised kingdom. The legal system also became stronger. Kings issued written law codes that explained how crimes should be punished and how disagreements should be settled. Judges and local assemblies continued to hear cases, but they followed rules that were approved by the king. This made justice more consistent across England. It also helped people understand what was expected of them and what would happen if they broke the law. Religion continued to play an important role in uniting the kingdom. The Christian Church worked closely with the king. Bishops and abbots advised the ruler, helped educate future leaders, and kept written records. Churches and monasteries spread similar religious teachings throughout the country. They encouraged loyalty to both God and the king. Monasteries remained important centers of learning where books were copied, history was recorded, and young people were educated. Trade continued to grow during this period. Merchants travelled between English towns and foreign ports, carrying goods such as wool, cloth, grain, metal tools, pottery, wine, and fine jewellery. Busy markets appeared in many towns, bringing together farmers, craftsmen, and traders. Roads and rivers became important routes for travel and trade. The growth of trade brought more wealth to the kingdom and strengthened connections between different regions. Although England had become more united, it still faced dangers from outside. Viking attacks did not stop completely. Danish rulers still wanted control of England because of its wealth and fertile farmland. During the early 11th century, powerful Danish armies once again crossed the North Sea and invaded England. After years of fighting, the Danish king Snut conquered England in the early 11th century. He ruled not only England but also Denmark and Norway, creating a large kingdom that stretched across much of northern Europe. King Snut proved to be a capable ruler. Instead of destroying England's government, he kept many of its existing laws and officials. He worked with English nobles and church leaders to maintain peace and order. His reign showed that England already had a strong system of government that even a foreign king found useful. After Cnut's death, however, his empire began to break apart as his sons struggled to keep control. Eventually, the English royal family returned to power. One of the last Anglo-Saxon kings was Edward the Confessor. He ruled during the middle of the 11th century. Edward was known as a deeply religious man who spent much of his time supporting churches and monasteries. During his reign, he ordered the construction of a magnificent new church at Westminster, which later became known as Westminster Abbey. This church would become one of the most important religious and royal buildings in English history. Edward had no children, and this created great uncertainty about who would succeed him after his death. Several powerful men believed they had the right to become the next king. Among them was Harold Godwinson, one of the most powerful nobles in England. Another claimant was William, Duke of Normandy, who ruled a region in northern France. A third claimant was Harald Hardrada, the King of Norway, who also believed he had a rightful claim to the English throne. When Edward died in the middle of the 11th century, Harold Godwinson was chosen by the leading English nobles and crowned king. However, William of Normandy refused to accept Harold's rule. William claimed that Edward had promised him the English crown and that Harold had earlier sworn to support his claim. Harold denied these claims, and both men prepared for war. Before William could invade, Harold faced another serious threat from the north. Harald Hardrada of Norway invaded England with a large fleet and army. Harold quickly marched north with his soldiers and met the Norwegian forces near Stamford Bridge. The English won a great victory, and Harald Hardrada was killed in battle. Although this was an impressive success, Harold's army was exhausted after the long march and fierce fighting. Only a short time later, William crossed the English Channel with thousands of soldiers, horses, and ships. He landed on the southern coast of England and began advancing inland. Harold had to march his tired army all the way back to the south to face this new invasion. The two armies met at the Battle of Hastings in the middle of the 11th century. The English army fought mainly on foot and formed a strong defensive line along a hill. William's forces included skilled archers, infantry, and heavily armed cavalry. The battle lasted for many hours. The Norman soldiers launched repeated attacks against the English shield wall. Some attacks failed, but William continued to encourage his men and changed his tactics during the fighting. As the battle continued, the English defensive line slowly weakened. Some English soldiers left their positions to chase retreating Norman troops, allowing gaps to appear in the shield wall. The Norman cavalry took advantage of these openings and attacked with great force. During the fighting, King Harold was killed. Without their king, the English army lost its unity, and many soldiers fled the battlefield. William won a decisive victory. After the battle, William marched toward London. Some English leaders considered continuing the fight, but they realized that their chances of success were becoming smaller. William was accepted as king and was crowned in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day in the middle of the 11th century. His coronation marked the beginning of Norman rule in England. The Norman conquest brought enormous changes to English society. William rewarded the Norman nobles who had supported him by giving them large areas of land. Many Anglo-Saxon nobles lost their estates, and Norman lords became the new landowners. This completely changed the balance of power in England. Almost every important position in government, the army, and the church was gradually given to Normans or other loyal followers of William. William introduced a new system of land ownership based on loyalty to the king. Every noble held land from the king in return for military service and other duties. These nobles divided their lands among knights, who also promised to serve in times of war. This system became known as feudalism. It tied together the king, nobles, knights, and peasants through a network of duties and responsibilities. The Normans also built many castles across England. Most early castles were made from wood and earth, although many were later rebuilt in stone. These castles served as military strongholds, government centres, and homes for Norman lords. They allowed the new rulers to control important towns, roads, and river crossings. The presence of castles reminded local people that Norman authority was firmly established. The church also experienced major changes after the conquest. Norman bishops and abbots replaced many English church leaders. Large Romanesque churches and cathedrals were built throughout the country using impressive stone architecture. These buildings reflected both the wealth of the church and the growing power of the Norman rulers. Religious life continued much as before, but church organization became more closely connected with Normandy and the wider Christian world. The English language also began to change. The Norman rulers spoke a form of French, while the ordinary people continued speaking Old English. For many generations, both languages existed side by side. French became the language of the royal court, government, law, and many noble families. Over time, thousands of French words entered the English language. These new words mixed with Old English vocabulary, slowly creating the foundations of the Middle English language. William wanted to know exactly how much land and wealth existed in his kingdom. Toward the end of the 11th century, he ordered a detailed survey of England. Royal officials travelled throughout the country, recording information about landowners, villages, farmland, forests, livestock, mills, and other valuable property. The results were written into a great record known as the Domesday Book. It became one of the most detailed surveys ever produced in medieval Europe and helped the king collect taxes and manage his kingdom more effectively. Life for ordinary people changed in many ways after the conquest. Most peasants continued farming the land, raising animals and paying rents or services to their lords. However, many now served Norman landowners instead of Anglo-Saxon nobles. New taxes, stricter control and the building of castles placed additional demands on local communities. Even so, farming, village life and local traditions continued much as they had before, showing that not every part of daily life changed immediately. The Norman conquest marked the end of Anglo-Saxon rule and the beginning of a new period in English history. It united England under a powerful Norman monarchy, reshaped the country's government, transformed its nobility, changed its language, strengthened royal authority, and connected England more closely with continental Europe. Many of these changes continued to shape English society, politics, law, culture, and language for many centuries.